We got married yesterday, only special people were invited. Those words from my daughter-in-law, Aurora, cut through me like a knife. I stared at my son, Daniel, who couldn't even look me in the eye. For 3 years, I'd paid their rent, bought their furniture, filled their empty refrigerator when they had nothing. But apparently, I wasn't special enough for their wedding. Standing in my own living room, watching Aurora settle onto the couch I'd purchased for them, I felt something die inside me. What I didn't know was that this was just the opening move in their plan to take everything I had. They would bring lawyers to my door, file false reports to make me look incompetent, and ultimately try to have me declared legally unfit to manage my own life. My own son was about to become my greatest enemy. Before we begin today's story, please hit subscribe and like. Also, share in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. I was arranging the throw pillows on my couch when my daughter-in-law Aurora breezed through my front door without knocking. Again, she had that bright smile plastered on her face, the one that usually meant she wanted something. My son Daniel trailed behind her, eyes glued to his phone screen like it held the secrets of the universe. "Maggie, you'll never guess what happened!" Aurora practically bounced on her toes, her long blonde hair catching the afternoon light streaming through my living room windows. She was wearing one of those expensive athleisure outfits that cost more than my grocery budget for a week. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one my late husband Tom bought me for our 30th anniversary. The fabric was getting worn, but it still felt like home. "What's got you so excited?" Aurora grabbed Daniel's hand and held it up, showing off a simple gold band that definitely wasn't there the last time I saw them. "We got married yesterday at the county clerk's office." The words hit me like a slap. Yesterday. They got married yesterday, and I was just hearing about it now. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of nursing in the VA hospital had taught me how to mask my emotions when necessary. "Oh," I managed. "Congratulations." Daniel finally looked up from his phone, guilt written all over his face. He had his father's eyes, the same deep brown that used to comfort me when Tom was dying. Now they just looked uncomfortable. "Mom, we kept it small. You know how it is. Only special people were invited," Aurora added with a laugh that felt like nails on a chalkboard. She was already pulling out her phone, scrolling through what I assumed were wedding photos. "Look, my parents flew in from Phoenix. Dad cried during the vows." I leaned forward to see the screen. There were Aurora's parents, beaming and raising champagne glasses. There was Aurora in a simple white dress I'd never seen before. There was Daniel looking happier than I'd seen him in months. And there was absolutely no trace of me anywhere. 37 years ago, I held that baby boy in my arms and promised him I'd always be there. I taught him to ride a bike, bandaged his scraped knees, helped him with algebra homework, and cheered at every Little League game. When his father died 3 years ago, I held Daniel while he sobbed. And when he couldn't find steady work, I helped with his rent more times than I could count. But apparently, I wasn't special enough to witness him get married. "Well," I said, standing up and smoothing my cardigan, "I suppose I should say, welcome to the family officially now." Aurora beamed like she'd won the lottery. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, finally putting his phone in his pocket. The afternoon sun was starting to fade, casting long shadows across my hardwood floors. This house had seen so many family celebrations over the years. Birthday parties, graduations, holidays. I'd always imagined it would see Daniel's wedding reception too. "We should celebrate," I offered, though my heart wasn't in it. "I could make dinner, or we could go out somewhere nice." "Actually," Aurora said, checking her phone again, "we can't stay long. I have a Zoom call with a potential sponsor at 5. This whole wedding thing is going to be great for my Instagram engagement." Of course. Everything was content for Aurora's social media channels. She'd been trying to build a following as a wellness influencer for the past 2 years, posting about green smoothies and manifestation journals and expensive workout clothes, mostly using money I'd helped them with for rent and groceries. I walked them to the front door, my bare feet silent on the cool hardwood. The October air was crisp, carrying the smell of burning leaves from somewhere in the neighborhood. Across the street, my neighbor Gus was loading groceries into his old Ford pickup. He caught my eye and waved. "Thanks for understanding, Mom," Daniel said, leaning down to give me a quick hug. He smelled like the same cologne he'd worn since high school. "Of course," I lied. "I just want you to be happy." Aurora was already halfway to their car, a Toyota Camry with a dent in the rear bumper that they'd been meaning to fix for 6 months. Daniel followed her, his shoulders hunched in a way that reminded me of when he was a teenager and knew he'd disappointed me. I stood in my doorway and watched them drive away, the taillights disappearing around the corner toward the main road. The house felt too quiet behind me, too empty. I closed the door and leaned against it, finally letting my shoulders sag. In the kitchen, my refrigerator hummed quietly, covered with the usual collection of magnets and grocery lists and appointment reminders. One magnet caught my eye suddenly, a silly thing Aurora had given me last Christmas. It was bright red with white lettering that read, VIPs only. At the time, I'd thought it was cute. Now it felt like a cruel joke. The next morning, I was watering my potted mums on the front porch when Aurora's car pulled into my driveway with more urgency than usual. She jumped out clutching her phone and a venti Starbucks cup, her hair pulled back in what she called a messy bun, but probably took 20 minutes to perfect. Maggie, thank God you're up! She rushed toward me, her yoga pants and oversized sweatshirt making her look younger than her 33 years. We have a situation. I set down my watering can and braced myself. In the 3 years since Daniel started dating Aurora, I'd learned that her situations usually involved money they didn't have and bills they couldn't pay. The pattern was always the same. She'd work herself into a panic, present the crisis, like it was life or death, and then look at me with those big blue eyes until I offered to help. What kind of situation? The rent is overdue. She waved her phone at me like it was evidence in a court case. Our landlord is being totally unreasonable. He says if we don't pay by noon today, he's starting eviction proceedings. Can you believe that? It's only been 5 days. Only 5 days. I bit my tongue to keep from pointing out that rent was typically due on the first of the month, which had been a week ago. Instead, I watched her pace back and forth on my driveway, her designer sneakers squeaking against the concrete. Did you transfer the money from your account? She continued. I know we talked about it, but I don't see it in our checking yet. We hadn't talked about it. She'd sent me a text at midnight 3 days ago that said, "Rent help, please," with a series of crying emoji. I'd responded that we could discuss it in person, but apparently she'd taken that as a yes. Aurora, I haven't transferred anything yet. We need to sit down and talk about this properly. Her face fell, and for a moment she looked genuinely panicked. But Maggie, you always help. I don't understand what's different now. What was different was that I'd spent yesterday evening going through my credit union statements, adding up 3 years of emergency transfers. What was different was that I'd bought a soft rose-colored dress for a wedding I was never invited to attend. What was different was that I'd realized I hadn't heard from either of them in 2 months before yesterday's surprise visit. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I glanced across the street where Gus was checking his mailbox. He'd been my neighbor for 8 years, ever since his wife Dolores passed away. He was a Vietnam veteran with silver hair and kind eyes, who always asked about my health and remembered to bring in my garbage cans when I was at my weekly church volunteer shift. Gus caught my eye and nodded, the way neighbors do when they sense tension but don't want to intrude. I wondered what he thought of the drama that seemed to unfold in my driveway every few weeks. How much is the rent? I asked, though I already knew the answer. It was always $1,200 for their one-bedroom apartment in the newer complex near the river. $1,200 plus a $50 late fee. So $1,250 total. Aurora's voice had taken on that pleading tone that usually worked on me. I promise this is the last time. Daniel's got a couple of drone video projects lined up for next month, and I'm really close to landing that partnership with the supplement company. I'd heard variations of this promise for 3 years. Daniel's freelance drone work was sporadic at best, and Aurora's influencer dreams seemed to cost more money than they generated. But they were family. They were all I had left since Tom died. Let me think about it, I said finally. Aurora's perfectly contoured face crumpled. Think about it? Maggie, we need an answer now. The landlord isn't going to wait. Then, maybe you should have talked to me before the rent was a week overdue. The words came out sharper than I intended, and Aurora actually stepped back like I'd slapped her. We stood there in my driveway, the morning sun warming the concrete between us, and I realized something had shifted. The automatic yes that usually lived on the tip of my tongue wasn't there anymore. I'll call you in an hour, I said. Aurora stared at me for a long moment, then got back in her car without another word. She backed out of my driveway fast enough to leave rubber marks on the concrete. I picked up my watering can and finished tending to my mums. their bright orange and yellow faces turned toward the sun. Across the street, Gus was still by his mailbox, pretending to sort through bills, but clearly keeping an eye on me. "Everything okay, Maggie?" he called out. "Just family stuff," I called back. He nodded and headed back toward his house, but not before giving me a look that said he understood exactly what kind of family stuff I was dealing with. Gus had raised 3 kids on his own after coming back from Vietnam. He knew a thing or two about when to help and when to let people figure things out for themselves. Back inside my kitchen, that VIPs only magnet seemed to glow red on my refrigerator door. I stared at it while my coffee finished brewing, thinking about special people and overdue rent and phone calls that only came when money was needed. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I spent the next hour in my home office, a converted bedroom where Tom used to pay bills, and I now managed what was left of our retirement savings. The desk was still his, a heavy oak piece his father had built in 1952, but the chair was mine now, adjusted for my shorter frame. Spread across the desktop were 3 years of credit union statements, each month's transfers highlighted in yellow. 500 here, 800 there, 1,200 for rent, 400 for groceries, 300 for Daniel's truck insurance. The numbers blurred together until they formed one devastating total, $33,247. $33,000. More than Tom's first-year salary when he got back from his Army deployment in the 80s. More than I spent on groceries in 2 years. More than enough to have taken that cruise to Alaska I'd been putting off since Tom died. I pulled out receipts from Target and Costco, purchases Aurora had asked me to make for their apartment. Kitchen supplies, bedding, a fancy blender for her smoothie videos, a baby monitor they claimed was for their landlord's dog. None of it had been paid back, despite promises that they'd settle up once Daniel's business picked up. On my computer screen, I scrolled through text messages from Aurora. They followed a predictable pattern: weeks of silence, then sudden contact when money was tight. "Hey Maggie, hope you're doing well. Quick question about rent." Or, "Hi there. Would you mind grabbing a few things from Costco? I'll send you the list." Never, "How are you feeling?" Or, "Want to grab lunch?" Just requests wrapped in forced cheerfulness. I opened my dresser drawer and pulled out the soft rose dress I'd bought for the wedding. It still had the tags on it, $68 at Macy's, marked down from $120. I'd imagined wearing it to the ceremony, maybe getting my hair done at the salon first. I'd pictured dancing with Daniel at the reception, the way he used to stand on my feet when he was little. And we'd waltz around the living room to Tom's old records. Instead, the dress hung in my closet like a reminder of how foolish I'd been to assume I mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Aurora. "Any word on the transfer? Getting worried over here." I stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone aside without responding. On my computer, I clicked over to my online banking, where I could see the automatic transfers I'd set up months ago. One for Daniel's phone bill, one for Aurora's gym membership, one for their car insurance. Monthly payments that came out of my account like clockwork. Money I'd never expected to see again. Was I trying to buy love? I whispered to the empty room. The question hung in the air like dust motes in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through my office window. Tom's Army commendation plaques watched silently from the wall, reminders of a man who understood the difference between helping and enabling. I clicked on my iPhone's calendar app, something I'd barely used until Aurora convinced me to share calendars, so she could keep track of my volunteer schedule and church commitments. But when I opened it now, something was wrong. All the shared events from Aurora were gone. The yoga classes she'd invited me to, the farmers market dates, the family dinners that had been planned but never happened. The calendar showed only my own appointments, doctor visits, church volunteer shifts, YMCA water aerobics. A small red notification badge blinked in the corner of the screen. I clicked on it and found a system message. Aurora Voss has stopped sharing calendar access. The timestamp showed yesterday, right around the time they would have been at the county clerk's office getting married. She'd cut me out of her calendar the same day she'd cut me out of the wedding. I closed the laptop and sat back in Tom's chair, looking around the office that held 38 years of marriage memories. Our tax returns from the year Daniel was born. Insurance papers from when Tom was diagnosed with cancer. Photos of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and Little League championships. All those years of being needed, of being the person people came to when life got hard. When Tom was sick, I was strong for him. When Daniel struggled in school, I hired tutors. When Aurora wanted to start her Instagram business, I listened to her dreams and helped where I could. But somewhere along the way, helping had become expected, and expected had become taken for granted. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Aurora. Maggie, I'm getting really stressed about this rent situation. Can you please just let me know something? I picked up the phone and typed back. I need some time to think. For the first time in 3 years, I meant it. The soft rose dress went back in the drawer, tags intact. 2 days later, I walked into the local credit union where Tom and I had banked for 25 years. The lobby smelled like industrial carpet and coffee from the machine in the corner, familiar scents that usually made me feel at home. Today, everything felt different. Sarah, the teller who'd helped us refinance the house back in 2019, waved me over to her window. She was probably 40, with kind eyes and a photo of twin boys taped to her computer monitor. Mrs. Hale, how are you doing today? I'm well, Sarah. I need to review some account activity and make some changes to my automatic transfers. Sarah pulled up my account on her computer, and I watched her face shift from friendly professionalism to something more serious. She glanced around the lobby, then leaned closer to the window. Mrs. Hale, I probably shouldn't mention this, but there was a third-party inquiry about your accounts last week. My stomach dropped. What kind of inquiry? Someone called claiming to be your son, asking about your account balances and recent transfer history. I couldn't disclose anything without proper authorization, of course, but I thought you should know. Daniel had been checking up on my finances behind my back. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, sharp and sudden in my chest. Thank you for not giving out any information, I managed. Of course not. We take privacy very seriously here. Sarah printed out forms for me to sign, authorizing a review of all my automatic payments and transfers. Is everything okay at home, Mrs. Hale? You seem a little stressed. I signed my name with hands that shook slightly. Just some family financial planning. You know how it is. But Sarah's concerned expression suggested she knew it was more than that. She'd probably seen this before. Adult children trying to access their parents' accounts, testing boundaries, preparing for something bigger. After I left the credit union, I sat in my Honda Civic in the parking lot and opened my email app. Sure enough, there was a security alert from 3 days ago. Your account was accessed from a new device in Portland, Oregon. The timestamp was 2:47 a.m., definitely not a time when I'd be checking my balance. Someone had been in my email account. Someone who knew my password or had figured it out. I wrote down the date and time in the small notebook I kept in my purse. The same kind of documentation habits I'd learned during my nursing years. If something was happening here, I wanted evidence. My phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. The first time he'd called since the wedding announcement. Hi, Mom. How are you? His voice sounded casual, but there was an edge to it I'd never heard before. Like he was reading from a script. I'm fine, sweetheart. How's married life? Great, really great. Aurora's so happy. A pause. Hey, I heard you were at the credit union today. Everything okay with your accounts? My blood went cold. How did he know where I'd been? Had someone seen me there and called him? Or was he monitoring something I didn't know about? Just routine business, Daniel. Why do you ask? No reason. Just want to make sure you're not having any problems. You know how those bank systems can be glitchy sometimes. I sat in my car, watching other customers go in and out of the credit union. Normal people doing normal banking business. Not people whose children were apparently tracking their financial activities. Daniel, did you try to call the credit union about my accounts? Long silence. Too long. Why would I do that, Mom? It wasn't a denial. It was a question designed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel paranoid or confused. I recognized the technique from my years working with patients who had family members trying to take advantage of them. I was just wondering. The teller mentioned someone had called. Well, it wasn't me. Maybe it was identity theft or something. You should probably be more careful with your information. The conversation ended with awkward goodbyes and promises to get together soon that we both knew were lies. I sat in my car for another 10 minutes, watching the afternoon traffic on the street outside, feeling like my safe, predictable world was shifting beneath my feet. When I got home, I changed all my online passwords and set up two-factor authentication on my banking accounts. Then I called my phone company and added extra security questions to my wireless account. If my own son was trying to access my finances, I needed to protect myself. The thought made me sick, but ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. That night, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at my kitchen table, looking at that VIPs only magnet on my refrigerator. The irony wasn't lost on me that the people treating me like I wasn't a VIP were the same ones expecting VIP treatment for themselves. Wednesday evening found me in the church kitchen, stirring a massive vat of beef stew for the weekly community supper. The kitchen was warm and steamy, filled with the chatter of volunteers preparing rolls and setting up tables in the fellowship hall. This had been my routine for 6 years, ever since Tom died, and I needed something to fill the empty Wednesday nights. I had my phone propped against the industrial-sized salt container, talking to my sister Linda in Ohio on speaker while I worked. Linda was 2 years older and had always been the practical one, the sister who spoke her mind, whether you wanted to hear it or not. "So let me get this straight," Linda was saying, her voice echoing slightly in the kitchen. "They got married without telling you. They're behind on rent again. And now Daniel's calling the bank asking about your money? That about sums it up." I added more salt to the stew and stirred, the wooden spoon making lazy circles in the thick broth. "And you're still thinking about helping them?" Other volunteers moved around me, filling water pitchers and arranging dessert donations on serving platters. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the church food pantry, caught my eye and mouthed, "Everything okay?" I nodded and tried to look more composed than I felt. "It's Thanksgiving season, Linda. Maybe one last transfer, you know? Family forgives." "Family forgives, Maggie, but family also doesn't take advantage." Linda's voice got sharp, the way it did when she thought I was being naive. "When was the last time Daniel called just to check on you? Not because he needed money, not because Aurora wanted something, but just to see how his mother was doing?" I stirred the stew more vigorously, trying to think. There had been a call in July, but that was about his truck registration, one in May about Tom's tools in the garage. Actually, I couldn't remember the last time Daniel had called just to talk. He's busy building his business. Stop making excuses for him. You raised a good kid, Maggie, but somewhere along the way, he forgot how to be a son instead of just a customer. The words hit harder than I expected, and I had to pause my stirring to wipe my eyes with my sleeve. Around me, the church kitchen buzzed with conversation and preparation, but I felt suddenly isolated in my own little bubble of family drama. "Linda, he's all I have left." "No, he's not. You have yourself, and you have people who actually care about you. But you're going to lose yourself if you keep letting them treat you like an ATM. Mrs. Peterson appeared at my elbow with a concerned expression. "Maggie, honey, you look upset. Do you need to step outside for a minute?" I shook my head and tried to smile. "Just family stuff. I'm okay." But I wasn't okay, and Linda could hear it in my voice even through the phone speaker. "Set boundaries," Linda continued. "Being a mom to an adult doesn't mean being an ATM. If Daniel needs money, he can get a job like everyone else. If Aurora needs rent money, she can find a roommate or move somewhere cheaper. But what if they really are in trouble? Then they'll figure it out like adults do. Maggie, you're 69 years old. You should be spending your money on yourself, on the things you want to do while you're healthy enough to enjoy them. Remember that Alaska cruise you used to talk about?" I did remember. Tom and I had planned to take an Alaskan cruise for our 40th anniversary before he got sick. After he died, I'd thought about going alone, maybe with Linda. But there was always something Daniel needed, some emergency that took priority over my dreams. "I hear what you're saying, Linda. I really do. But you're still going to send them the money." I wasn't sure how to answer that. My head knew Linda was right, but my heart was still stuck in the role I'd played for 3 years, the reliable backup plan, the safety net, the person who made problems disappear with a transfer from her savings account. "I need to think about it." "Well, think fast. Because from what you've told me, they're not exactly patient when it comes to getting what they want." After we hung up, I finished stirring the stew in thoughtful silence. The fellowship hall was filling up with people who came for the free meal, seniors on fixed incomes, single parents stretching their budgets, people who just needed a warm place to eat and feel welcome. These were my people, I realized. People who understood what it meant to make do with less, to prioritize needs over wants, to treat every dollar as precious, because every dollar was earned through hard work. When had I stopped seeing Daniel and Aurora as people who needed to learn those lessons? When had I started seeing them as people I needed to rescue instead? My phone buzzed with a text from Aurora. Hope you've had time to think. Landlord's getting antsy. XOXO. I stared at the message for a long moment, then put my phone back in my pocket without responding. For tonight, the stew needed my attention more than they did. Saturday afternoon, I drove across town to Daniel's apartment complex, a modern development with generic beige buildings and postage stamp balconies. I'd been here dozens of times over the past 3 years, usually delivering groceries or furniture or checks to solve whatever crisis had emerged that week. Daniel buzzed me up to the second floor, and I climbed the stairs slowly, my knees reminding me that I wasn't as young as I used to be. The hallway smelled like cleaning products and someone's attempt at home cooking. He opened the door before I could knock, looking disheveled in a way that was probably calculated to make me feel sorry for him. His hair was messy, his t-shirt wrinkled, and he had that defeated expression he'd perfected as a teenager when he wanted something. "Hey, Mom. Thanks for coming over." The apartment looked different than I remembered. Brighter somehow. There was new furniture I hadn't seen before. A sleek white desk by the window, a ring light set up in the corner for Aurora's videos, and several unopened boxes from Costco stacked against the far wall. "You've been redecorating?" I observed. Aurora looked up from her laptop on the couch, where she appeared to be editing photos. "Oh, hi, Maggie. Yeah, we got some new stuff for content creation. The lighting in here was terrible before." I recognized the desk and the ring light. I'd seen them in ads online, and they weren't cheap. Probably $800 for the desk alone. Another $300 for the professional lighting setup. "That's nice," I said carefully. "How did you manage new furniture when you can't make rent?" Daniel and Aurora exchanged a look. One of those married couple communications that happen in split seconds. "Actually," Daniel said, settling into what I now realized was a new IKEA armchair I'd helped them buy last month. "That's what we wanted to talk about. We've got some short-term cash flow issues, but there's a big project coming up right after Thanksgiving. A whole wedding weekend that needs drone footage." Aurora closed her laptop and turned to face me with that bright influencer smile. "And I've got a partnership deal with a wellness brand that's about to go through. It's like bridge money, you know? Just until Black Friday weekend." Bridge money? That was a new term in their vocabulary of financial euphemisms. Before it had been emergency help and temporary assistance. Now they were making it sound like a business loan. "How much bridge money are we talking about?" "2,000 should cover everything," Daniel said quickly. "Rent, utilities, groceries, gas. We'll pay you back from the wedding job." $2,000! Not the $1,200 they'd asked for earlier in the week. The amount had grown, the way these requests always seemed to grow once I was physically present and harder to say no to. I looked around the apartment again, taking inventory. The ring light that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The unopened Costco boxes that suggested they weren't exactly struggling for basic necessities. The new desk that someone had clearly assembled recently, given the Allen wrench still sitting on the kitchen counter. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" "Sure, Mom. When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Not because you needed money or wanted me to pick something up, but just to check on your mother?" He looked genuinely confused by the question. "I don't know." "Why?" "Just wondering." I sat down on their couch. The same couch I'd helped them move in 3 years ago. "When was the last time we had dinner together, when you didn't need anything from me?" Aurora shifted uncomfortably. "Maggie, we're really grateful for all your help. You know that, right?" "I know you say that. But gratitude and taking advantage aren't the same thing." The words hung in the air between us. Daniel's face went through several expressions: surprise, hurt, and finally something that looked like anger. "Taking advantage?" "Mom, we're family. Family helps each other." "You're right, family does help each other. But this feels more like family helping one direction only." I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the parking lot where my Honda sat next to their Toyota. Both cars needed repairs they couldn't afford, but somehow there was money for ring lights and new furniture. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. Aurora's influencer mask slipped, showing genuine panic underneath. "Time to think? Maggie, the rent is due Monday. We can't wait for you to think about it. Then maybe you should have thought about it before you spent money on equipment and furniture." I headed for the door, but Daniel caught my arm gently. "Mom, please. We're not asking for the world here. Just help us get through the next couple weeks." I looked at my son, this 37-year-old man, who still expected his mother to solve his problems, and felt something inside me shift permanently. "I'll let you know," I said. As I drove home, I passed the credit union where I'd changed my passwords, the church, where Linda's words echoed in my memory, and finally, my own neighborhood where Gus was working in his garden. Normal people living normal lives, handling their own responsibilities. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't sure I was going to say yes. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock on Monday morning, which should have been my first warning. Daniel and Aurora never showed up anywhere on time, let alone early. I opened the door to find them standing on my porch with two people. I didn't recognize a woman in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase, and a man with a leather portfolio. "Mom, we brought some people to help us sort everything out," Daniel said, his voice unnaturally formal. The woman in the suit stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Hale, I'm Jennifer Walsh, and this is Notary Michael Chen. Your son has retained my services to help streamline some family financial management. I didn't invite them in, but they moved past me anyway, settling themselves around my dining room table like they owned the place." Aurora was unusually quiet, sitting with her hands folded and avoiding eye contact. "I'm sorry, but what exactly is this about?" I remained standing, my hand still on the front door. Jennifer Walsh opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick document. "We've prepared a durable power of attorney that will make things much easier for everyone involved. It will allow Daniel to help manage your finances, pay your bills, handle banking transactions, really streamline the process." My blood went cold. A power of attorney. They wanted legal control over my money. "I can manage my own finances just fine, thank you." "Of course you can," the attorney said, in that patronizing tone people use with elderly clients they think are confused. "This is just to make things more convenient. Daniel mentioned you've been having some trouble keeping track of payments and transfers." I looked at my son, who was staring at his hands like a guilty child. "Daniel, is that what you told them?" "Mom, you've been stressed lately. Making some unusual decisions. We just want to help." Unusual decisions. Like questioning why I should pay their rent. Like asking when they'd last called just to check on me. Like wondering why they'd gotten married without inviting their only family member. Michael Chen, the notary, had set up a portable scanner and was arranging papers on my dining room table. "If you could just sign here, Mrs. Hale, we can get this all sorted out today." I walked to the table and looked at the documents. Pages and pages of legal language. But the gist was clear. Daniel would have the authority to access my bank accounts, make financial decisions on my behalf, and essentially control every dollar I had. And what do I get out of this arrangement? Jennifer Walsh looked confused by the question. "You get peace of mind, knowing your finances are being handled professionally. By my son who can't pay his own rent?" Aurora finally looked up. "Maggie, this is really the best thing for everyone. You won't have to worry about money anymore." "I'm not worried about money. I'm worried about signing over control of my money to people who seem to think it belongs to them already." I picked up the signature page and looked at it for a long moment. 43 years of marriage, 6 years of widowhood, a lifetime of working and saving and being responsible. All of it reduced to a signature on a legal document that would make me financially powerless in my own life. Instead of signing, I tore the page cleanly in half. Then I tore it again, and again. The pieces fluttered into the wastebasket beside my dining room table like confetti at a funeral. "I think you all need to leave now." Jennifer Walsh's professional mask slipped. "Mrs. Hale, you're making a mistake. Your son is only trying to help. My son is trying to help himself to my bank account. There's a difference." Aurora's face had gone hard, all traces of her usual sweetness gone. "Maggie, you're being unreasonable. We're family. Family doesn't ambush each other with lawyers and try to steal their autonomy." Michael Chen was already packing up his equipment, clearly wanting no part of whatever this was becoming. Jennifer Walsh gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. "Daniel, your mother is obviously not thinking clearly today. Perhaps when she's had time to reconsider." "She's thinking perfectly clearly," I interrupted. "And what she's thinking is that you all need to leave my house immediately." After they left, I sat in my dining room for a long time, staring at the torn pieces of paper in my wastebasket. My hands were shaking from adrenaline, but underneath the fear was something I hadn't felt in years: absolute clarity. They hadn't come here to help me. They'd come here to take control of my life, to make themselves the legal guardians of my money and my decisions. And they'd done it with smiles and lies, and the assumption that I was too old or too confused to understand what was happening. I picked up my phone and did something I should have done weeks ago. I called Priya Desai, an elder law attorney whose name I'd gotten from a pamphlet at the credit union. Ms. Desai? My name is Maggie Hale, and I think I need some legal advice about my family. It was time to stop being the victim in my own life story. That evening, I sat in my garage among Tom's old tools and Christmas decorations, trying to process what had happened. The concrete floor was cold through my slippers, but I needed space away from the house where they'd tried to steal my independence. My head was pounding from stress and anger, and I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to make sense of how my son had become someone I didn't recognize. When had Daniel changed from the boy who used to bring me dandelions he'd picked from the yard into this stranger who showed up with lawyers and lies? Am I being unfair? I whispered to the dusty garage air. Tom's workbench still held his coffee can full of screws and washers, untouched since he'd last used them 3 years ago. He'd always been the practical one, the person who could fix anything with the right tool and enough patience. What would he think about what Daniel had tried to do today? I pulled out my phone and opened Instagram, something I rarely did anymore. Aurora's profile was full of the usual wellness content, green smoothies, yoga poses, inspirational quotes about manifesting abundance. But there, just posted 2 hours ago, was a video from their wedding day. I watched Aurora raise a champagne glass to the camera, her smile radiant in the courthouse lighting. "To new beginnings and having the people who truly matter by your side," she said. Behind her, Daniel nodded agreement, while Aurora's parents beamed with pride. The people who truly matter. Not me, apparently. The video continued with Aurora's father, giving an impromptu toast about love and commitment and family. Her mother wiped away tears. Daniel laughed at something someone said off camera. It looked like a beautiful, intimate ceremony shared with people they loved. People they loved. Just not me. I closed the app and sat in the silence of the garage, surrounded by the detritus of Tom's life and mine. Garden tools I barely used anymore. Holiday decorations for celebrations I increasingly spent alone. Boxes of Daniel's childhood belongings that he'd never asked for and probably didn't want. When had I become someone they saw as an obligation instead of a person they enjoyed being around? My phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Mrs. Hale, this is Aurora. I'm calling from a different phone." Her voice was different too. Cold, businesslike, stripped of all the fake warmth she usually used with me. "What do you want, Aurora? We need to talk about the rent situation. It's due today, and our landlord isn't going to wait any longer." "That sounds like a problem you and Daniel need to solve yourselves." "Maggie, don't be like this. We're family now. Families help each other through difficult times." Family. The word had lost all meaning, the way words do when people use them as weapons instead of expressions of love. "You want to talk about family? Let me ask you something. When you planned your wedding, did you ever think about inviting me? Even for a second?" Silence on the other end. "When you decided who the special people were, did my name come up at all?" More silence. Family helps each other, Aurora. But it also includes each other. It celebrates together and mourns together and makes decisions together. What you and Daniel have been doing isn't family. It's exploitation. You're being dramatic. Am I? You brought lawyers to my house today to try to take control of my money. You've been checking up on my bank accounts behind my back. You've asked me for over $30,000 in 3 years and never paid back a cent. But I'm being dramatic? Aurora's voice got sharper. "We never asked you to keep track of every penny." "No, you just asked me to keep giving you every penny." I took a deep breath and said the words I should have said months ago. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm not paying your rent today. I'm not paying your rent ever again. From now on, you and Daniel are responsible for your own financial decisions." "Maggie, you can't be serious. Didn't I tell you at the wedding reception I wasn't invited to? I only help special people now." I hung up before she could respond. Sitting in Tom's garage, surrounded by the tools of a man who'd understood the value of honest work and personal responsibility, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. For the first time since Tom died, I was putting my own needs first, and it felt like coming home to myself. Over the next 3 days, I made changes I should have made years ago. First, I called the credit union and canceled every automatic transfer to Daniel's accounts. The phone bill, the gym membership, the car insurance, all of it. Sarah, the teller, didn't ask questions, but I could hear approval in her voice. Next, I changed my email password and added two-factor authentication to everything I could think of. If Daniel had been accessing my accounts, he wasn't going to do it anymore. Then I called my phone company and added extra security questions to my wireless account. The customer service representative, probably dealing with elder financial abuse more often than she'd like, walked me through additional protections without making me feel paranoid or foolish. Finally, I made an appointment with Priya Desai for the following week. Her voice on the phone was calm and professional, and she didn't seem surprised when I explained that family members were trying to pressure me into giving them control of my finances. Unfortunately, Mrs. Hale, this is more common than you might think. We'll make sure your interests are protected. Wednesday evening, my phone started ringing from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to Aurora's increasingly frantic messages. Maggie, it's Aurora. Please call me back. We really need to talk about the rent situation. Maggie, hi, it's Aurora again. I know you're upset about something, but we need to work this out like adults. Maggie, this is getting ridiculous. Call me back immediately. The messages got angrier and more demanding as the day went on. By Thursday morning, my voicemail was full. That afternoon, my phone rang from yet another unfamiliar number. Maggie! Aurora's voice was tight with barely controlled rage. We need that rent money today. The landlord has started eviction proceedings. I'm sorry to hear that. You're sorry to hear that? Maggie, this is serious. We could lose our apartment. Then you should probably find a way to pay your rent. We can't find $1,200 by tomorrow. You know we don't have that kind of money. But I do, right? That's what this comes down to. You don't have money, but I do, so it's my problem to solve. Aurora was quiet for a moment, probably trying to figure out what approach might work on me. Maggie, I don't understand why you're being so cruel. We've never done anything to hurt you. Cruel. I was being cruel by not enabling their irresponsibility. I was being cruel by expecting them to handle their own lives like adults. Aurora, let me explain something to you. When I was your age, Tom and I lived in a studio apartment that cost 40% of our take-home pay. We ate ramen noodles and shopped at thrift stores and worked extra shifts when we needed money. We didn't call our parents for bailouts. That was a different time. No, it was a different attitude. We understood that being adults meant taking responsibility for our choices. So you're just going to let us become homeless? I looked out my kitchen window at my neighbor Gus, who was washing his old Ford pickup in his driveway. Gus had raised 3 children alone after coming back from Vietnam, working double shifts at the paper mill and never asking anyone for help. His kids were grown now, successful and independent, and they called him every week just to check in. Aurora, you're not going to become homeless. You're going to figure out how to pay your own bills, just like every other responsible adult in the world. But we're family! Family doesn't try to trick each other into signing over power of attorney. Family doesn't check up on each other's bank accounts without permission. Family doesn't exclude each other from weddings and then expect financial support. I paused, looking at that VIPs only magnet on my refrigerator one more time. You said only special people were invited to your wedding. Well, from now on, I only help special people too. And people who try to steal my independence and take advantage of my love don't qualify as special. I hung up before she could respond. Within an hour, Daniel called from his regular number. Mom, what the hell is going on? Aurora says you're refusing to help with rent. That's right. Why? What did we do wrong? The question was so oblivious, so completely lacking in self-awareness, that I almost laughed. Daniel, do you really not know? Know what? We asked for help with rent, same as always. Now suddenly you're acting like we're criminals. Same as always. He just summarized our entire relationship in 4 words, and he didn't even realize how damning that was. Goodbye, Daniel. I turned off my phone and sat in my quiet kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Gus's garden hose. For the first time in 3 years, no one was asking me for money. No one was treating me like a walking ATM. No one was making me feel guilty for wanting to be valued as a person instead of just a bank account. It felt like the first day of the rest of my life. The next morning, I was watering my front porch plants when Gus appeared at my driveway carrying a toolbox and what looked like some kind of electronic device. Morning, Maggie. Thought you might be interested in upgrading your home security situation. I set down my watering can and walked over to meet him. Gus was wearing his usual uniform of khaki pants and a polo shirt, his silver hair neatly combed despite the early hour. In all our years as neighbors, he'd never been one for small talk, but he had a way of showing up exactly when I needed help. What kind of upgrade? He held up the device, which I now recognized as a video doorbell. Ring doorbell with a motion-activated floodlight. Figured after yesterday's excitement, you might want to know who's coming and going around here. Yesterday's excitement. He'd probably seen Daniel and Aurora's cars in my driveway, heard raised voices, noticed the tension that seemed to follow them everywhere lately. I don't know anything about installing those things. Lucky for you, I do. 30 years in maintenance at the paper mill teaches a man how to wire pretty much anything. We spent the next hour installing the doorbell and floodlight, Gus patiently explaining how the system worked while I held tools and asked questions. The device would record video whenever someone approached my front door, and I could watch the footage on my phone or save it to the cloud. Why would I want to save the footage? Gus looked at me over his reading glasses, the expression of someone who'd seen enough of the world to understand how people could disappoint you. Because sometimes you need proof of what really happened, especially when people start telling different versions of the story. He showed me how to download the Ring app and connect it to my home Wi-Fi. Within minutes, I was watching a live video feed of my own front porch, complete with motion alerts and night vision capability. This is remarkable technology. It's also evidence, Gus said, putting away his tools. If someone comes to your door uninvited, if they're aggressive or threatening, if they try to say something happened, that didn't happen. You'll have video proof. We tested the system by having me walk to my mailbox and back. Sure enough, my phone buzzed with an alert, and I could watch myself on the screen in real time. There's one more thing we should do, Gus said. He pulled out a small notebook from his shirt pocket. We should keep a log. Dates, times, who shows up, what they want. If this situation with your family escalates, documentation is going to be important. Do you think it will escalate? Gus was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Maggie, I've seen this before. Not exactly this, but similar situations. When people get used to taking advantage of someone's generosity, they don't usually accept boundaries gracefully. He was right, of course. Daniel and Aurora had built their entire financial strategy around my willingness to bail them out. Now that I'd closed that ATM, they were going to have to either learn to manage money like adults or find someone else to exploit. Will you help me keep track of things? Of course. We'll put together a system that would make the Army proud. That afternoon, Gus returned with a small external hard drive from Dell and showed me how to back up video files from the Ring system. We set up a simple spreadsheet on my laptop to track dates, times, visitor names, and notes about what happened. Facts beat spin every time, he said, saving our first entry. If someone tries to say you're confused or paranoid or not taking care of yourself, you'll have evidence to the contrary. As if summoned by our conversation, Daniel's truck appeared at the end of my street, driving slowly like he was checking to see if my car was in the driveway. There's your first test case, Gus observed. We watched on my phone as Daniel parked across the street and sat in his truck for several minutes, apparently talking on his phone. The Ring camera captured everything clearly, his license plate, the timestamp, even his facial expression through the windshield. After 10 minutes, he drove away without getting out of the truck. Interesting, Gus said, making a note in our log. October 15th, 3:20 p.m. Subject observed property from public street. No contact attempted. Subject: military habits DeHart. But it's good to be precise about these things. We spent another hour setting up the system and making sure I understood how to access everything. By the time Gus left, I felt more prepared and less vulnerable than I had in days. That evening, I sat on my front porch, watching the neighborhood settle into its evening routine. Kids riding bikes, people walking dogs, normal families doing normal things. The Ring floodlight cast a bright circle on my driveway, and I could see the small camera lens watching over everything. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I wasn't facing it alone. My phone buzzed with a motion alert. Someone was walking up my front steps. The woman at my front door was probably 50, wearing a navy blue pantsuit and carrying an official-looking clipboard. The Ring camera captured her clearly as she rang the doorbell at exactly 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Mrs. Hale? I'm Jennifer Morrison from Adult Protective Services. We've received a report of concern about your well-being, and I'd like to speak with you for a few minutes. My stomach dropped. Adult Protective Services. Someone had called APS and reported that I needed intervention. I had a pretty good idea who that someone might be. What kind of concern? May I come in? It's easier to discuss these matters privately. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Everything I'd read about elder abuse suggested that I should be careful about letting strangers into my home, but this was an official government worker responding to what was presumably an official complaint. Can I see your identification? She showed me her APS badge and business card. Everything looked legitimate, but I'd learned to be more cautious about taking things at face value. Ms. Morrison, I'd like to call my attorney before we talk. Her eyebrows went up slightly. Mrs. Hale, this isn't a legal proceeding. I'm just here to make sure you're safe and getting the support you need. Even so, I'd prefer to have legal representation present. I called Priya Desai's office from my cell phone, and thankfully she was available to come over immediately. Don't discuss anything until I get there, she advised. Just be polite and ask her to wait. Ms. Morrison didn't seem particularly happy about the delay, but she agreed to sit on my front porch and wait. I offered her a glass of water and tried to stay calm while we waited for Priya to arrive. 20 minutes later, a silver Honda pulled into my driveway, and a woman about my age got out carrying a briefcase. Priya Desai was smaller than I'd expected from her voice on the phone, probably 5'2" with graying black hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple gray dress and practical shoes, and her handshake was firm and confident. Mrs. Hale, I'm glad you called me. Ms. Morrison, I'm Mrs. Hale's attorney. What seems to be the issue here? Ms. Morrison consulted her clipboard. We received a report that Mrs. Hale may be experiencing cognitive decline, financial exploitation, and isolation from family members. The caller expressed concern that she's been making unusual decisions and may need protective services. Who made this report? Priya asked. I can't disclose the identity of the caller, but they claim to be a family member with knowledge of Mrs. Hale's recent behavior. I looked at Priya, who nodded slightly. We both knew who had made that call. What kind of unusual decisions? Priya continued. Ms. Morrison flipped through pages on her clipboard. Refusing family financial assistance, canceling automatic payments, changing security passwords, installing surveillance equipment, and expressing paranoid thoughts about family members trying to access her accounts. Every single thing they'd reported was something I'd done to protect myself from their exploitation. But through the lens of an APS investigation, my self-defense measures looked like signs of cognitive decline. I'd like to present some documentation, Priya said, pulling folders from her briefcase. These are Mrs. Hale's medical records from her annual physical last month, including cognitive assessments, clean bill of health, no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment. She handed over a folder. These are her medication lists, showing she takes only prescribed medications for blood pressure and arthritis, both well managed. Here's her activity schedule: YMCA water aerobics 3 times a week, church volunteer work every Wednesday, book club twice a month. Another folder: bank statements showing consistent, responsible financial management. No unusual purchases, no signs of being scammed or exploited. And here are receipts documenting over $30,000 in financial support she's provided to family members over the past 3 years, none of it repaid. Ms. Morrison looked through the documentation with growing surprise. This doesn't match the picture that was painted in the complaint. No, it doesn't, Priya agreed. What we have here is an elder who has set reasonable financial boundaries with adult children who were taking advantage of her generosity. The unusual decisions are actually protective measures she took after family members attempted to gain legal control over her finances without her consent. Ms. Morrison made notes on her clipboard. Mrs. Hale, are you comfortable living independently? Do you feel safe in your home? I feel much safer now that I've taken steps to protect my financial independence, I said. The surveillance equipment was installed because family members were monitoring my activities and attempting to access my accounts without permission. And you understand your financial situation? You're able to manage your bills and banking? I've been managing my own finances for over 40 years. My cognitive abilities are fine. My judgment is fine. What's changed is that I'm no longer allowing people to take advantage of my desire to help. Ms. Morrison spent another 20 minutes asking questions and reviewing Priya's documentation. Finally, she closed her clipboard and stood up. Mrs. Hale, based on my assessment and the documentation provided, I see no evidence of cognitive decline, financial vulnerability, or need for protective services. You appear to be managing your affairs appropriately and making reasonable decisions about your relationships and finances. As she walked to her car, I noticed Daniel's truck parked at the end of the street again, far enough away to avoid the ring camera, but close enough to watch my house. Ms. Morrison noticed too. Is that the family member who's been concerning you? Probably. She made a note in her file. Mrs. Hale, if you experience any harassment or feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call our office again. Sometimes when people establish boundaries, others don't respect them. After Ms. Morrison left, Priya and I sat on my front porch, discussing what had just happened. They tried to use the system against you, she said. APS investigations can be weaponized by people who want to make their victims look incompetent or paranoid. Will there be other investigations? Possibly. But now there's an official record that you're competent and managing your affairs appropriately. That will make future complaints much harder to substantiate. Daniel's truck was still at the end of the street, but as soon as Priya left, it drove away. That evening, I updated my log October 16th. APS investigation, initiated by family complaint, cleared with no action required. The documentation was already proving useful. Saturday morning brought another surprise visitor. This one more familiar, but equally unwelcome. Ruth Ellison, the HOA president from 3 streets over, marched up my driveway, carrying an official-looking envelope and wearing the expression of someone who'd appointed herself the neighborhood's moral authority. I knew Ruth from church committee meetings, where she had a reputation for making mountains out of molehills and turning every discussion into a personal crusade. She was probably 66, with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of rigid posture that suggested she'd never relaxed a day in her life. Maggie, I need to speak with you about some concerns that have been brought to my attention. Good morning, Ruth. What concerns? She handed me the envelope, which contained an official HOA notice on letterhead. There have been complaints about unusual activity at your property. Excessive visitors, surveillance equipment installed without architectural approval, and general disruption of the neighborhood's peaceful character. I scanned the notice, which cited specific HOA covenants about exterior modifications and activities that may disturb the quiet enjoyment of neighboring properties. At the bottom was Ruth's signature as HOA president, along with a demand that I appear at the next board meeting to address these violations. Ruth, the surveillance equipment is a doorbell camera. Half the houses in this neighborhood have them. Yes, but yours was installed in response to what appears to be ongoing family conflict. We've had reports of raised voices, multiple vehicles coming and going at odd hours, and generally disruptive behavior. Reports from whom? I had a sinking feeling that the same people who'd called APS had also been busy recruiting neighborhood allies. Who made these reports? Ruth consulted her own clipboard. Apparently the weapon of choice for people trying to control other people's lives. I'm not at liberty to disclose specific names, but multiple residents have expressed concern. Multiple residents, or one resident who contacted multiple people? Ruth's carefully composed expression flickered slightly. The source of the reports isn't as important as addressing the underlying issues. I looked across the street, where Gus was working in his garage with the door open. He caught my eye and started walking over, probably sensing that I might need backup. Ruth, I said carefully, I haven't violated any HOA rules. I haven't disturbed anyone's quiet enjoyment of their property. What I have done is set boundaries with family members who were taking financial advantage of me. That's really not the HOA's concern. You're right, it's not. So why are you making it your concern? Gus arrived at my driveway just as Ruth was starting to look uncomfortable. Morning, Ruth. Problems. Just HOA business, Gus. Nothing that concerns you. Actually, if it involves harassing my neighbor with frivolous complaints, it does concern me. Gus took the notice from my hands and read it quickly. Surveillance equipment without architectural approval? Ruth, this is a doorbell camera. I installed it myself, and there's nothing in the HOA covenants that requires approval for security devices. Ruth's jaw tightened. The board feels that Mrs. Hale's recent behavior suggests she may need additional support in managing her property and her personal affairs. The board feels that, or you feel that? Gus handed the notice back to me. Because I've been Maggie's neighbor for 8 years, and I've never seen her manage her affairs more competently than she has in the past week. I looked at Ruth, this woman I'd known from church for over a decade, and realized she'd been recruited as part of Daniel and Aurora's campaign to make me look incompetent. How many people had they contacted? How many neighbors had they convinced that I was having problems? Ruth, let me ask you something. When was the last time you and I had a conversation before today? She shifted uncomfortably. I don't see how that's relevant. I'm just wondering how you became so concerned about my welfare that you felt the need to file an HOA complaint. Because in all our years of living in the same neighborhood and attending the same church, you've never once asked about my welfare before. Gus was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who'd figured out exactly what was happening. Ruth, did someone contact you about Maggie? Someone who suggested she might be having problems? I receive information from various sources. That's not an answer, I said. Did my son or daughter-in-law call you and suggest that I was becoming incompetent or dangerous? Ruth's silence was answer enough. I see. And based on that phone call from people you've never met, you decided to file an official complaint against a neighbor you've known for years. Maggie, if you're having family difficulties, I'm having difficulties with family members who are trying to control my finances and my life. And apparently, they've recruited you to help them do it. Ruth looked genuinely surprised by this interpretation. I was told you were isolated and making poor decisions. I thought I was helping. You were told that by people who are angry that I stopped giving them money. Did they mention that part? Ruth gathered her papers and started backing toward her car. The board meeting is next Thursday at 7 p.m. if you'd like to address these concerns formally. After she left, Gus and I stood in my driveway, looking at the HOA notice. They're building a case, he said. APS investigation yesterday, HOA complaint today. They're trying to create an official paper trail that makes you look incompetent. What's next? Hard to say, but we need to document all of this and start building our own paper trail. That afternoon, I drove to the credit union and asked Sarah for a letter confirming my account management history. She provided a document stating that I'd been a customer in good standing for 25 years, with no signs of financial mismanagement or cognitive issues. When I got home, my Ring camera had captured Daniel's truck, making another slow pass by my house. This time, Aurora was with him in the passenger seat. The campaign to prove I was incompetent was intensifying. Monday morning's mail delivery brought the bomb I'd been expecting, but dreading. The thick envelope from Washington County Probate Court sat in my mailbox like a coiled snake, official and threatening and impossible to ignore. I carried it inside with shaking hands and spread the contents across my kitchen table. At the top of the first page, in bold, legal typeface, were the words that made my blood run cold. Petition for conservatorship of the person and estate of Margaret Rose Hale. My son was trying to have me declared legally incompetent. I read through the petition slowly, my coffee growing cold as I absorbed the allegations. According to the document, I was showing signs of cognitive decline and impaired judgment. I was isolated from family members and making financial decisions that suggest diminished capacity. I was vulnerable to exploitation and in need of protective oversight. The petition requested that Daniel be appointed as my legal conservator, giving him authority over my medical decisions, living arrangements, and all financial affairs. Essentially, it would make me a legal child in my own life. Attached to the petition were sworn statements from witnesses supporting the claims. Ruth Ellison had provided an affidavit stating that I'd been acting strangely and installing surveillance equipment in response to paranoid beliefs about family members. She claimed to have observed unusual activity at my property and expressed concern about my ability to live independently. The second statement was from May Chen, the pharmacist at my neighborhood pharmacy. Her affidavit claimed that I'd been making erratic medication purchases and had seemed confused about my prescriptions during recent visits. I stared at May's signature, trying to remember any interaction that could have been misinterpreted as confusion. I'd been going to the same pharmacy for 15 years, always organized, always prepared with my insurance cards and prescription lists. Then I remembered. Last month, Aurora had offered to pick up my monthly medications while I was at a church meeting. She'd said it would save me a trip, and I'd given her my insurance information. Had she said something to May about my mental state? Had she planted seeds of doubt about my competency? My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone to call Priya Desai. Mrs. Hale, I was expecting your call. These petitions are serious legal matters, but they're not uncommon in situations like yours. How can Daniel do this? How can he try to have me declared incompetent when there's nothing wrong with my mind? Unfortunately, conservatorship petitions can be filed by any concerned family member. The burden is on us to prove that you're competent and that the petition is inappropriate. Priya explained that we had 30 days to respond to the petition and prepare for a court hearing. During that time, the court would likely order a psychological evaluation and appoint an independent attorney to represent my interests. What happens if they win? If the court grants the conservatorship, Daniel would have legal authority over your finances, medical care, and living arrangements. You would essentially lose your legal independence. The weight of those words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Everything I'd worked for, everything Tom and I had built together, everything I'd saved and planned and dreamed about for my retirement would be under the control of a son who saw me as nothing more than a bank account. After hanging up with Priya, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the legal papers that represented the complete destruction of my autonomy. On the refrigerator, that VIPs only magnet seemed to mock me with its cheerful red letters. My phone rang. Daniel's number appeared on the screen. "Mom, I heard you got some legal papers today. We need to talk." "We certainly do. Look, I know this seems scary, but it's really for your own good. You've been making some concerning decisions lately, and we just want to make sure you're protected." "Protected? From what? From my own judgment? From my own money? From my own life? Daniel, you're trying to have me declared legally incompetent. How is that for my own good?" "Mom, you've been acting paranoid and isolated. You installed surveillance cameras. You're refusing help from family. You called APS on yourself just to prove a point." "I didn't call APS on myself." "You did." Silence. "And the HOA complaint? Did you call Ruth Ellison and suggest that I was having problems?" More silence. "Daniel, you're my son. I gave birth to you. I raised you. I loved you unconditionally for 37 years. And now you're trying to take away my legal rights because I won't give you money anymore." "It's not about money, Mom. It's about making sure you're safe." "Safe from what?" "From managing my own finances responsibly? From setting boundaries with people who take advantage of me? From living independently in the house I've called home for 30 years? Safe from making mistakes that could hurt you." I looked around my kitchen, at the bills organized neatly on the counter, at the medication organizer I filled every Sunday, at the calendar, where I kept track of appointments and activities and volunteer commitments. The only mistake I made was raising a son who thinks he's entitled to control his mother's life. I hung up before he could respond. That evening, I called my sister Linda in Ohio and read her the entire conservatorship petition. "My God, Maggie, they're really doing this. They're really doing this. What do you need from me?" For the first time since this nightmare began, I started to cry. Not from fear or anger, but from relief that someone in my family still saw me as a person worth defending. "I need you to remind me that I'm not crazy. That setting boundaries doesn't make me incompetent. That protecting myself from financial abuse doesn't make me paranoid. You're the sanest person I know, Maggie. And if Daniel can't see that, then he's the one with problems." I went to bed that night with the conservatorship petition on my nightstand, a reminder that the battle for my independence was just beginning. Tuesday morning, I drove across town to the neighborhood pharmacy where I'd been a customer for 15 years. Machen was behind the counter, her usual friendly smile noticeably absent when she saw me approaching. "Mrs. Hale, how can I help you today?" "Hello, May. I wanted to talk to you about the affidavit you signed regarding my mental competency." Her face went pale, and she glanced around nervously to see if other customers were listening. The pharmacy was relatively quiet. Just an elderly man browsing the vitamins and a young mother waiting for a prescription. "Mrs. Hale, I'm not sure what you mean." I pulled out a copy of the conservatorship petition and turned to her signed statement. "This affidavit, where you claim I've been confused about my medications and making erratic purchases." May's hands fluttered nervously as she recognized her own signature. "Oh, that. Yes, that. May, we've known each other for 15 years. In all that time, have I ever seemed confused to you? Have I ever had problems with my medications or insurance?" "No, Mrs. Hale. You've always been very organized." "Then why did you sign a legal document stating otherwise?" May looked around the pharmacy again, then asked another pharmacist to cover the counter for a few minutes. She led me to a quiet corner near the blood pressure machine. Mrs. Hale, a young woman came in here last week. She said she was your daughter-in-law and that your family was concerned about your health. She asked me to sign something for insurance purposes. What exactly did she tell you? She said you'd been having some memory issues and that the family was trying to get better medical coverage for you. She had this form and said it just needed a signature from your pharmacy to verify that you were a regular customer. My heart sank. Aurora had manipulated May into signing what she thought was an insurance form, when it was actually a legal affidavit that could be used to take away my independence. May, did you read the document before you signed it? She looked ashamed. Not carefully. She said it was just routine paperwork, and I was busy with other customers. I trusted that she was telling the truth about being your daughter-in-law. What exactly did the document say when you signed it? It was mostly blank. She said the insurance company would fill in the details later. I just signed a line that said something vague about irregular purchases, but I thought that meant insurance billing irregularities. I felt a mixture of anger and sympathy. May had been deceived, manipulated into providing a signature that Aurora and Daniel could use to build their case against me. May, I need you to understand something. That wasn't an insurance form. It was an affidavit for a legal proceeding where my son is trying to have me declared mentally incompetent so he can control my finances. Her face went white. Oh my God. Mrs. Hale, I had no idea. I would never. I know you wouldn't. But I need your help to fix this. I called Priya Desai from the pharmacy and put her on speaker so she could explain to May what had happened and what we needed to do. Within an hour, Priya arrived with a correction affidavit for May to sign. This document states that you were misled about the purpose and contents of the original affidavit, Priya explained. It clarifies that Mrs. Hale has never shown signs of confusion or incompetence in your professional interactions with her. May signed the correction without hesitation, her hands still shaking from the realization of how she'd been used. Mrs. Hale, I'm so sorry. If I'd known what they were really doing. It's not your fault, May. They lied to you the same way they've been lying to everyone else. As we left the pharmacy, Priya and I discussed the implications of what we'd discovered. This shows a pattern of deception and manipulation, she said. They're not just disagreeing with your decisions, they're actively undermining your reputation and tricking people into supporting their case. What about Ruth Ellison's statement? We should talk to her too. I suspect she wasn't given the full story either. That afternoon, I drove to Ruth's house. A pristine colonial with perfectly manicured landscaping that probably cost more to maintain than most people's mortgages. Ruth answered the door looking uncomfortable, like she'd been expecting this conversation. Maggie, I suppose you want to discuss the conservatorship petition. I want to discuss how Daniel and Aurora convinced you to sign an affidavit against me. Ruth invited me in, and we sat in her formal living room surrounded by china cabinets and family photos. Everything was perfectly arranged, perfectly clean, perfectly controlled, much like Ruth herself. They called me last week, she admitted. They said you were having some kind of breakdown, that you'd become paranoid and isolated. They were worried about your safety. And based on that phone call from people you'd never met, you decided I was incompetent? They said you'd installed surveillance equipment because you thought people were trying to steal from you. They said you'd been making wild accusations about family members. It sounded like… She paused. It sounded like what happened to my mother, before we had to put her in memory care. I understood now. Ruth's mother had developed dementia, and Ruth had been through the painful process of taking away her independence for her own safety. Daniel and Aurora had played on those memories, making my legitimate self-defense measures sound like paranoid delusions. Ruth, have you ever seen me act confused or incompetent? No, but have I ever seemed paranoid or delusional in any of our interactions over the years? No. Then why did you believe them instead of trusting your own observations? Ruth was quiet for a long moment, looking at her hands folded in her lap. Because they're family. I thought family members would know better than neighbors. Family members who are trying to gain control of my finances. Family members who brought lawyers to my house, trying to trick me into signing over power of attorney. Family members who excluded me from their wedding and then expected me to pay their rent. I told Ruth the whole story, from the surprise wedding announcement to the conservatorship petition. I watched her expression change as she realized how completely she'd been manipulated. Oh, Maggie. I had no idea. They made it sound like you were in real danger. I am in real danger, Ruth. But not from my own mind. From people who want to control me. Ruth agreed to sign a correction affidavit. And by evening, we'd neutralized 2 of the 3 witness statements supporting the conservatorship petition. But as I drove home, I noticed Daniel's truck following me at a distance. When I turned into my neighborhood, he turned too. When I pulled into my driveway, he parked across the street and sat there watching my house. The Ring camera captured it all, adding another entry to our growing log of harassment and surveillance. The people trying to have me declared incompetent were the ones acting like they'd lost their minds. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how my life had become a legal battlefield where my own son was the enemy. The house felt too quiet, too empty, full of memories of better times when family meant support instead of exploitation. At 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went to the living room, where Tom's army photo sat on the mantel next to our wedding picture and Daniel's high school graduation portrait. 3 generations of my life, 3 stages of love and hope and dreams for the future. I picked up Tom's photo and traced his face with my finger. He'd been so proud when Daniel was born, so sure that his son would grow up to be a good man who took care of his family. What would Tom think about what Daniel had become? Did I fail as a mother? I whispered to the photo. Did I do something wrong that made him think this was okay? The tears came then, hot and angry, and full of grief, not just for Tom, but for the son I thought I'd raised. I cried for the little boy who used to bring me dandelions, for the teenager who'd cried in my arms when his girlfriend broke up with him, for the young man who'd promised at his father's funeral that he'd always take care of me. When had love turned into obligation? When had family become a transaction? When had my son decided that my money was more important than my dignity? Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop fighting this, Maggie. You're only making it worse for yourself." Aurora, probably using a friend's phone or a burner number. The message felt like a threat, a warning that worse things would happen if I didn't surrender my independence voluntarily. I screenshot the message and added it to our documentation file. By morning, I'd made a decision. If Daniel and Aurora wanted a fight, I was going to give them one. But I was going to fight smart, with evidence and witnesses, and the kind of systematic approach Tom had taught me during his military years. I called Gus at 7 a.m. "I need help documenting everything," I told him. "Every lie they've told, every person they've manipulated, every piece of evidence that shows what they're really trying to do. I'll be right over." We spent the morning in my home office, organizing 3 years of financial records, screenshots of text messages, and witness statements from May and Ruth. Gus helped me create a timeline that showed the pattern: clearly requests for money, followed by periods of no contact, followed by more requests for money. "Look at this," Gus said, pointing to my phone records. "January through March, Daniel called you 12 times, all within 2 days of when his rent was due. April and May, when you were helping with his truck payment, he called 8 times. June and July, when they didn't need money, 0 calls. The pattern was undeniable. I wasn't Daniel's mother most of the time I was his ATM. We printed out Aurora's Instagram posts from the past year, showing expensive purchases, restaurant meals, and vacation trips, all time-stamped right after I'd sent them money for emergencies. "Emergency rent money that went to Cabo," Gus observed, looking at photos of Aurora on a beach with a cocktail. "Emergency grocery money that went to designer yoga clothes. Emergency car repair money that went to professional photography equipment." By afternoon, we had a comprehensive file that told the real story of my relationship with Daniel and Aurora. It wasn't the story of a confused elderly woman making poor decisions. It was the story of financial abuse disguised as family concern. That evening, I drove to the church for Wednesday dinner preparation, needing the familiar comfort of community service and honest work. But as I stirred the weekly pot of stew, my phone started buzzing with messages. Aurora's friends had apparently launched a social media campaign, posting about my abandonment of my struggling young family. The messages ranged from concerned to accusatory, all based on Aurora's version of events, where I was a selfish grandmother, refusing to help my son in his time of need. "Shame on you for turning your back on family," one message read. "How can you let your own son become homeless?" asked another. "Your husband would be ashamed of you," said a third. And that one hit like a physical blow. I showed the messages to Mrs. Peterson, who'd been watching me with growing concern. Oh, honey, they're trying to turn people against you. It's working. Look at these responses. People think I'm a terrible person. Mrs. Peterson took my phone and scrolled through the messages, her expression getting angrier with each one. These people don't know you. They don't know what you've been through or how much you've given. They're judging you based on lies. She handed my phone back and looked at me seriously. Maggie, I've known you for 6 years. I've watched you volunteer every Wednesday, donate to every church fundraiser, and help every family in crisis that's come through our doors. You're one of the most generous people I've ever met. Then why do I feel so guilty? Because they want you to feel guilty. Guilt is a tool, and they're using it to manipulate you. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, with all the documentation spread out around me, financial records, witness statements, screenshots of social media attacks, and the conservatorship petition that threatened to end my independence. I thought about Linda's words, set boundaries. I thought about Priya's legal strategy. I thought about Gus's military precision in documenting everything. I thought about May's willingness to correct her mistake, and Ruth's recognition that she'd been manipulated. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel alone. I had allies, evidence, and most importantly, I had the truth on my side. Daniel and Aurora had made a critical error. They'd assumed I would be too ashamed, too isolated, or too confused to fight back effectively. They'd forgotten that I was Tom Hale's wife, a woman who'd survived military deployments and cancer treatments and decades of life's challenges. They'd forgotten that I'd been a nurse in a VA hospital, trained to handle crises and protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit them. They'd forgotten that I was stronger than they thought. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Thursday morning, Gus appeared at my front door carrying his laptop and wearing the focused expression of someone with a mission. "We need to check something in the ring footage," he said. "I've been thinking about that day Daniel and Aurora were here with the lawyers." We sat at my kitchen table while Gus accessed the Ring app on his computer, scrolling back through days of recorded footage. The system had captured everything: delivery trucks, neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes, and multiple instances of Daniel's truck cruising slowly past my house. "Here," Gus said, pointing to the screen. "Tuesday afternoon, right after you refused to sign the power of attorney." The footage showed Daniel and Aurora walking to my mailbox, not to my front door. They looked around nervously. Then Daniel opened the mailbox and started pulling out envelopes. Aurora held them up to the light, apparently photographing them with her phone. Then they stuffed everything back and closed the mailbox. "They were going through your mail," Gus said quietly, "looking for bank statements, financial information, anything they could use." I watched my son rifle through my private correspondence like a common thief and felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about control, about people who felt entitled to access every aspect of my life without permission. Is this illegal? Tampering with someone else's mail is a federal crime, and we have video evidence of them doing it. Gus saved the footage to his external hard drive and made several backup copies. "This changes everything, Maggie. This shows intent to access your financial information without authorization." I stared at the frozen image of Daniel holding my bank statement up to Aurora's phone camera. When had my son become someone I didn't recognize? When had the boy who used to help me bring in groceries turned into someone who would steal my mail? "There's more," Gus said, scrolling through additional footage. "Look at this." Another video showed Aurora alone, checking my mailbox on a different day. She pulled out several pieces of mail, photographed them, and returned them. The timestamp showed it was the day before the conservatorship petition was filed. "They were gathering intelligence," Gus said, "building a case by accessing your private financial information." We spent the morning documenting every instance of mailbox tampering, creating a file that showed a clear pattern of surveillance and information gathering. Combined with the evidence of manipulated witness statements and fraudulent APS reports, it painted a picture of calculated harassment designed to support their legal case. My phone rang. Priya Desai's name appeared on the screen. "Mrs. Hale, we have a court date, November 15th, 10 a.m. The judge wants to review the conservatorship petition and hear testimony from both sides." "How long do we have to prepare?" 3 weeks. "I'm going to request an independent psychological evaluation to demonstrate your competency. and I want to present all the evidence you've been gathering about their financial manipulation and harassment. After hanging up, I looked at Gus, who was still reviewing footage on his laptop. 3 weeks to prove I'm not crazy. 3 weeks to prove they are, he corrected. Look at this behavior, Maggie. Normal people don't rifle through their mother's mail. Normal people don't manipulate pharmacists into signing false statements. Normal people don't launch social media campaigns to destroy their family members' reputation. He was right. The more evidence we gathered, the clearer it became that Daniel and Aurora's actions were far more concerning than anything I'd done to protect myself. What's our next step? We're going to create a presentation that would make the Pentagon proud. Timeline, documentation, video evidence, witness statements. We're going to show that judge exactly who the competent adult is in this situation. That afternoon, I called my sister Linda and told her about the court date. I'm coming out there, she said immediately. You're not facing this alone. Linda, you don't have to. Yes, I do. We're family, Maggie. Real family. The kind that shows up when you need them, not the kind that shows up when they need money. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely hopeful. I had evidence, allies, and 3 weeks to prepare. A defense that would protect my independence and expose the truth about Daniel and Aurora's campaign to control my life. But as I looked at the video footage of my son going through my mail like a burglar, I realized that winning this case wouldn't just save my freedom, it would also mark the end of any real relationship with the only child I had left. Some victories came at a price that broke your heart, even as they saved your life. Monday morning found me in Priya Desai's office, a small but efficient space in a downtown building that smelled like coffee and leather-bound law books. Priya had transformed our documentation into a comprehensive legal strategy that looked more like a military operation than a family dispute. We're going to present this case in phases, she explained, spreading color-coded folders across her conference table. Phase 1 establishes your competency through medical and psychological evidence. Phase 2 demonstrates the pattern of financial abuse you've endured. Phase 3 exposes their campaign of manipulation and harassment. The first folder contained my medical records, cognitive assessments, and a letter from my doctor confirming my mental and physical health. The second held 3 years of financial records, showing the systematic drain on my savings, along with evidence that none of the loans had ever been repaid. The third folder was the most damaging screenshots of social media posts, witness statements from May and Ruth about being deceived, and the video footage of Daniel and Aurora going through my mail. This is impressive documentation, Priya said. Most people in your situation don't have this level of evidence. I had good help, I said, thinking of Gus's military precision and systematic approach to building our case. Priya opened her laptop and showed me a timeline she'd created. A clean chart that tracked every financial request against every period of family contact. The pattern was impossible to deny. Daniel and Aurora only called when they needed money, and they only visited when I said no. Look at this data, she said, pointing to a graph. In the 36 months before you stopped providing financial support, you had meaningful family contact calls just to check on you. Visits without requests for money, less than 8% of the time. 8%. Out of 3 years, my son had treated me like family, instead of an ATM less than 1 month total. The psychological evaluation is scheduled for Thursday, Priya continued. Dr. Sarah Martinez is one of the most respected neuropsychologists in the state. She'll administer standardized tests for cognitive function, financial judgment, and decision-making capacity. What if I don't test well? What if the stress affects my performance? Mrs. Hale? You've been managing your own household, finances, and medical care without any assistance. You've organized a complex legal defense and gathered evidence that would impress any investigator. You volunteer regularly at your church and maintain an active social calendar. These are not the activities of someone with cognitive impairment. She pulled out another folder, this one containing character references from my church, my bank, my doctor, and several neighbors. Mrs. Peterson had written a particularly strong letter detailing my 6 years of volunteer service and my reputation for reliability and good judgment. But the most compelling evidence, Priya said, is their behavior. Look at this objectively. Who's acting more competently here? The person who set reasonable financial boundaries and took steps to protect her independence? Or the people who are rifling through mailboxes, manipulating witnesses, and filing false reports with government agencies? That afternoon, Gus and I worked on organizing the video evidence into a presentation that would be clear and compelling for the judge. We created a simple chronology. First, Daniel and Aurora's visits escalated when I started saying no to financial requests. Then came the lawyers and the attempted power of attorney, followed by the APS complaint and HOA harassment. And finally, the mail tampering and conservatorship petition. It's a textbook case of escalating harassment, Gus observed. They started with manipulation, moved to legal pressure, then tried to use official agencies to intimidate you, and finally resorted to illegal surveillance of your mail. The question is whether the judge will see it that way. Any reasonable person looking at this evidence will see it that way. The challenge is making sure Daniel and Aurora can't muddy the waters with more lies and manipulation. Wednesday evening, I was preparing dinner when my doorbell rang. The Ring camera showed a young woman I didn't recognize, probably in her 20s, holding a clipboard and wearing a badge. Mrs. Hale? I'm Katie from the Washington County Adult Services Division. I have a few follow-up questions from your recent APS investigation. I called Priya immediately. Don't let her in, Priya advised. The APS investigation was closed with no action required. There's no legitimate reason for a follow-up unless someone has filed a new complaint. I spoke to Katie through the door. I'd prefer to have my attorney present for any official discussions. Mrs. Hale, this is just a routine welfare check. It'll only take a few minutes. Then it can wait until my attorney is available. Katie left, but not before the Ring camera captured her taking photos of my front porch and making notes on her clipboard. I immediately called the APS supervisor, who'd handled the original investigation. Mrs. Morrison, this is Maggie Hale. Someone claiming to be from Adult Services just tried to interview me, but I don't have any open cases. You're right, Mrs. Holly. Your case was closed with no action required. No one from our office should be contacting you unless a new complaint has been filed. Has a new complaint been filed? Let me check. Yes, actually. Someone called yesterday claiming you'd been making threats against family members and showing signs of paranoid behavior. But given the circumstances of your previous case, we flagged it as potentially harassment-related. Another false complaint. Daniel and Aurora were systematically trying to build an official record of mental health concerns, probably hoping to use it as evidence in the conservatorship hearing. But this time, they'd overplayed their hand. The APS supervisor was already suspicious, and we now had documentation of a pattern of false reports designed to harass and intimidate me. Mrs. Hale, I want you to know that if these complaints continue, we may need to consider whether someone is weaponizing our services against you. That's a serious matter that we take very seriously. Thursday morning, I drove to Dr. Martinez's office for my psychological evaluation, carrying a folder full of evidence that I was the most competent person in this entire situation. It was time to prove it officially. Dr. Sarah Martinez's office was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the sterile clinical environment I'd imagined, it was warm and comfortable, with soft lighting and plants in the windows. Dr. Martinez herself was probably 50, with kind eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who'd spent years helping people navigate difficult situations. Mrs. Hale, I understand you're here for a competency evaluation related to a conservatorship petition. Before we begin the formal testing, I'd like you to tell me, in your own words, what's been happening. I told her everything, from the surprise wedding announcement to the conservatorship petition, trying to stay factual and avoid sounding emotional or vindictive. Dr. Martinez took notes and asked clarifying questions, but her expression remained neutral throughout. Now we'll move to the standardized assessments. These will test your cognitive function, memory, judgment, and decision-making abilities. The tests were more comprehensive than I'd expected. Memory exercises where I had to repeat sequences of numbers and words. Problem-solving scenarios where I had to plan hypothetical budgets and medical decisions. Cognitive assessments that measured my ability to process information and make logical connections. This section focuses specifically on financial judgment, Dr. Martinez explained, presenting me with scenarios involving bank accounts, investments, and major purchases. I want you to walk me through how you would handle each situation. The financial scenarios were straightforward: managing a checking account, deciding whether to loan money to family members, evaluating investment risks, planning for long-term care expenses, all things I'd been handling successfully for decades. Mrs. Hale, Can you tell me about your current financial management system? I described my bill paying routine, my budget tracking, my retirement planning, and the systematic approach I used for major financial decisions. Dr. Martinez seemed impressed by the level of organization and forethought I demonstrated. What about your recent decision to stop providing financial support to your son and daughter in law? Can you walk me through that decision making process? I explained how I'd tracked 3 years of financial requests, analyzed the pattern of contact only when money was needed, and ultimately concluded that I was enabling financial irresponsibility rather than helping with genuine emergencies. That sounds like a very rational assessment, Doctor, Martinez observed. How did your family respond to your decision? I told her about the power of attorney ambush, the APS complaints, the manipulated witness statements, and the conservatorship petition. Dr. Martinez's expression grew more serious as I described each escalation. Mrs. Hale, these responses suggest that your family members are more concerned with accessing your resources than respecting your autonomy. Your decision to set boundaries was not only reasonable, but necessary for your protection. The testing continued for nearly 3 hours, covering every aspect of cognitive function and decision-making ability. By the end, I felt confident that I demonstrated my competency clearly and comprehensively. When will you have the results? I'll have my report completed by early next week, but I can tell you preliminarily that your cognitive function is well within normal ranges for your age group, and your financial judgment appears to be excellent. That evening, I met with Priya to review the final details of our case presentation. She'd organized everything into a compelling narrative that told the story clearly. A competent adult had set reasonable boundaries with financially abusive family members, who had then launched a systematic campaign to have her declared incompetent so they could access her resources. The psychological evaluation should confirm your competency, Priya said. The financial records demonstrate the pattern of abuse. The video evidence proves harassment and illegal activity, and the witness statements show deliberate manipulation of third parties. What's their strongest argument? Honestly, they don't have one. Their entire case is based on the idea that setting boundaries with family members is evidence of mental decline. Any reasonable judge will see through that immediately. Saturday morning brought one final piece of evidence that sealed their fate. My iPhone's calendar app, which I'd largely forgotten about since Aurora had revoked my access to their shared calendar, showed a notification I'd missed. Buried in the app's history was a record of when Aurora had removed my calendar access the morning of their wedding, at exactly 9:47 a.m. She'd cut me out of their digital life at the same time she was excluding me from their real life. But more importantly, the calendar history showed every shared event that had been deleted: yoga classes I was never actually invited to join, family dinners that were planned but never happened, social events that existed only to make me think I was included in their lives. They were managing your perception of your relationship with them, Priya observed when I showed her the evidence, creating an illusion of family closeness while systematically excluding you from actual participation. It was psychological manipulation on a level I'd never imagined possible from my own son. Sunday evening, I sat in my living room reviewing our entire case file. 3 weeks of intensive preparation had produced a comprehensive defense that demonstrated not only my competency, but also the calculated nature of Daniel and Aurora's campaign against me. Tomorrow was the court hearing that would determine whether I retained my independence or lost control of my life to people who saw me as nothing more than a source of funding. I looked at Tom's photo on the mantel and thought about the promises we'd made to each other 40 years ago: to love, honor, and protect each other through all of life's challenges. Tom couldn't protect me anymore, but he'd taught me how to protect myself. He'd shown me the importance of careful planning, systematic documentation, and never backing down when you knew you were right. Tomorrow, I would honor his memory by fighting for the independence we'd built together. Tomorrow, I would prove that being a loving mother didn't mean being a helpless victim. Tomorrow, I would win. Monday morning, I dressed carefully in my best navy blue suit, the one I'd bought for Tom's funeral 3 years ago. It seemed appropriate. I was mourning the death of my relationship with Daniel, even as I fought to preserve my own life. The Washington County Courthouse was an imposing brick building downtown, with marble floors and high ceilings that made every footstep echo. Priya met me at the security checkpoint, carrying 2 briefcases. full of evidence and wearing the confident expression of someone who knew she had a winning case. "How are you feeling?" "Ready," I said and meant it. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic legal theater you see on television. Judge Patricia Wong sat behind a raised desk, a middle-aged Asian woman with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor. Daniel and Aurora sat at a table with their attorney, Jennifer Walsh, the same woman who'd brought the power of attorney to my house. Daniel wouldn't look at me directly, but Aurora stared with undisguised hostility, like I was the villain in this story instead of the victim. "This is a petition for conservatorship of Margaret Rose Hale," Judge Wong began. "Petitioners claim that Mrs. Hale suffers from cognitive decline and impaired judgment requiring protective oversight. Mrs. Hale contests these claims. We'll hear testimony from both sides." Jennifer Walsh stood first, presenting Daniel and Aurora's case with smooth legal language that made my protective measures sound like paranoid delusions. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hale has been exhibiting concerning behaviors over the past several months. She's installed surveillance equipment, made accusations against family members, refused reasonable assistance, and demonstrated poor financial judgment. Witnesses can attest to her declining mental state and increasing isolation. It was a masterful presentation of half-truths and manipulated facts, delivered with the kind of professional polish that might convince someone who didn't know the real story. Then Priya stood up, and everything changed. "Your Honor, I'd like to present a different picture. Mrs. Hale is a competent adult who recognized that she was being financially exploited and took reasonable steps to protect herself. The concerning behaviors described by petitioners are actually evidence of good judgment and appropriate self-advocacy." Priya activated her laptop, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. The first image was a clean financial chart, showing 3 years of transfers to Daniel and Aurora, totaling over $33,000 with zero repayment. "This is the pattern of financial abuse that Mrs. Hale identified and addressed. Note that family contact correlates directly with financial requests. When Mrs. Hale stopped providing money, contact ceased entirely." The next slide showed Dr. Martina's psychological evaluation results cognitive function above average for my age group. Excellent financial judgment. No signs of dementia or mental impairment. Mrs. Hale's competency has been professionally assessed and confirmed. The question before this court is not whether she's capable of managing her affairs. She clearly is, but whether her decision to stop enabling financial irresponsibility constitutes grounds for legal intervention. Jennifer Walsh objected. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hale has been making paranoid accusations against family members who are only trying to help." "Let's examine those accusations," Priya replied, clicking to the next slide. The courtroom screen filled with video footage from my Ring camera, showing Daniel and Aurora going through my mailbox, photographing my bank statements, and returning the mail to cover their tracks. Audible gasps filled the courtroom. Judge Wong leaned forward, studying the video intently. "This footage shows petitioners illegally accessing Mrs. Hale's mail and photographing her private financial information. Federal mail tampering charges aside, this hardly supports their claim that Mrs. Hale's security concerns were paranoid delusions." Priya presented witness statements from May and Ruth, showing how they'd been manipulated into providing false testimony. She showed the pattern of APS complaints, designed to create an official record of mental health concerns. She presented the social media campaign Aurora had launched to damage my reputation. "Your Honor, this is not a case of cognitive decline. This is a case of systematic harassment designed to isolate and intimidate an elderly woman who had the audacity to set financial boundaries with adult children who felt entitled to her resources." Judge Wong called a brief recess, and I sat with Priya reviewing our evidence, while Daniel and Aurora huddled with their attorney at the other table. Aurora was crying now, probably realizing that their lies were unraveling in real time. When court resumed, Judge Wong's expression had hardened noticeably. "I've reviewed the evidence presented by both sides. Mrs. Hale, would you please stand?" I stood on shaky legs, preparing to hear my fate. "Mrs. Hale, based on the professional psychological evaluation, your medical records, your financial management history, and your systematic documentation of this case, this court finds you to be fully competent to manage your own affairs." Relief flooded through me like a breaking dam. Furthermore, This court finds that the petitioner's behaviors, including mail tampering, witness manipulation, and filing false reports, constitute harassment rather than legitimate concern for Mrs. Hale's welfare. Judge Wong turned toward Daniel and Aurora's table, her voice taking on a stern tone. Petitioner's motion for conservatorship is denied. Additionally, petitioners are hereby ordered to cease all financial interference with Mrs. Hale and to refrain from trespassing on her property. The bailiff handed Daniel an official notice on police department letterhead, a formal no-contact order that would make any future harassment a criminal matter. It was over. I had won. My independence was secure. I squeezed Priya's hand, feeling simultaneously triumphant and heartbroken. I'd saved my freedom, but I'd lost my son in the process. Some victories came at the highest possible price. 3 months later, I stood in the living room of my house, surrounded by boxes and the accumulated memories of 30 years in one place. The decision to downsize hadn't been easy, but it felt necessary after everything that had happened. This house held too many ghosts, too many reminders of the family I'd thought I had. The 55 apartment community near the YMCA was perfect for my needs, smaller, easier to maintain, and filled with people who understood the value of independence. I'd be closer to my water aerobics classes, closer to the library, and closer to the volunteer opportunities that gave my life meaning. "You sure about this?" Gus asked, loading another box into his pickup truck. He'd insisted on helping with the move, even though his bad knee made lifting difficult. "I'm sure. This place has too many memories of people who turned out to be different than I thought." I'd gotten a good offer on the house from a young couple expecting their first child. It felt right, somehow, passing it on to people who were building a family instead of destroying one. The most difficult part had been deciding what to do with Daniel's childhood belongings, boxes of school projects, Little League trophies, family photos from happier times. In the end, I donated most of it to charity. If he wanted memories of his childhood, he should have acted like he remembered the values I'd taught him. "What about this?" Gus held up the VIPs only magnet that had spent months mocking me from my refrigerator door. "Throw it away!" I'd kept some things, of course. Tom's Army commendation and our wedding photo would come with me to the new apartment. My nursing school graduation picture, and the thank you cards from patients' families I'd helped over the years. Reminders of who I'd been before I became someone else's ATM. The credit union had helped me restructure my retirement accounts with additional fraud protections, and I'd established a modest charitable fund to help other seniors who might face similar exploitation. If Daniel and Aurora had taught me anything, it was that financial abuse of elderly people was more common than I'd ever imagined. "Mrs. Hale?" A young woman appeared at my front door, the buyer who was purchasing the house. "I wanted to thank you again for selling to us instead of going with a higher offer. You're starting a family here." "That feels right." She handed me a card. "I know this might sound strange, but would you mind if we kept in touch? My grandmother passed away last year, and I miss having an older woman's perspective on things." I looked at this young woman, probably Daniel's age, who understood that relationships with older people could be valuable for reasons that had nothing to do with money. I'd like that very much. That evening, I drove through my old neighborhood one last time, past the church where I'd volunteered, past Ruth's house, where she'd waved from her front porch, past the pharmacy where May had apologized again for being deceived. I didn't drive past Daniel's apartment complex. There was nothing there I needed to see. My new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modern building, with an elevator and a view of the mountains. The neighbors I'd met seemed genuine people who'd worked hard their whole lives, and were now focused on enjoying their independence rather than exploiting someone else's. "How's the settling in going?" Linda called from Ohio, checking on me like she had every few days since the court hearing. "Good. Really good, actually. I had lunch with 3 different neighbors this week, and none of them asked me for money. Imagine that." I laughed, something I'd been doing more often lately. "Linda, I want to ask you something. Do you think Tom would be proud of how I handled all this?" "Maggie, Tom would be furious that his son turned out this way, but he'd be incredibly proud of how you fought for yourself. You saved your own life." That night, I unpacked my art supplies for the first time in years. Tom had given me a watercolor set for Christmas 5 years ago, but I'd never had time to use it between all the family emergencies that needed my attention and my money. Now I had time. Now I had peace. Now I had the rest of my life to spend on people and activities that brought me joy instead of stress. I set up my easel by the window and looked out at the mountains in the distance. Tomorrow, I'd drive to the botanical garden and paint flowers instead of solving other people's problems. Tomorrow, I'd have lunch with people who wanted my company instead of my bank account. Tomorrow, I'd wake up knowing that my money was safe, my independence was secure, and my VIP list contained only people who had earned their place through respect and genuine care. It had taken 69 years, but I'd finally learned the difference between being needed and being used. And for the first time since Tom died, I felt truly free. 6 months after the court hearing, I discovered something unexpected. I was happier than I'd been in years. My apartment had become a sanctuary filled with watercolor paintings of local gardens, books. I actually had time to read, and most importantly, silence that felt peaceful instead of lonely. My phone still rang regularly, but now the calls were from people who genuinely cared about my well-being. Linda called every Sunday evening to catch up on our weeks. Mrs. Peterson from church called to discuss volunteer schedules and occasionally just to chat. Gus called to check if I needed anything from his weekly grocery runs. None of them ever asked for money. I'd joined a watercolor group that met Tuesday mornings at the community center and discovered I had a decent eye for landscapes. The group leader, a retired art teacher named Margaret, had encouraged me to enter a piece in the county fair's senior division. "You've got natural talent, Maggie. Have you always painted?" "No, this is something I started after I got my life back." The apartment complex had a small library where residents could borrow books or attend monthly book discussions. I'd become a regular, rediscovering my love for mystery novels and historical fiction. For the first time in years, I read for pleasure instead of distraction from family stress. But the most surprising development was my new volunteer work. The elder law attorney who'd referred me to Priya had asked if I'd be willing to speak with other seniors facing financial exploitation. My story had become a case study in how family members could weaponize legal systems against vulnerable adults. "Mrs. Hale," said Eleanor, a 74-year-old woman whose son had drained her savings for his gambling addiction. "How did you find the strength to fight back?" I realized that protecting myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. And I learned that real family supports your independence, not tries to take it away. These conversations were difficult but important. So many elderly people felt guilty for setting boundaries with exploitative family members. Like standing up for themselves somehow made them bad parents or grandparents. The hardest part, I often told them, is accepting that people you love might not have your best interests at heart. But once you accept that, you can protect yourself without feeling guilty about it. One Thursday afternoon, I was painting irises in the botanical garden when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. "Mrs. Hale? This is Dr. Patricia Kim from Oregon Health Sciences University. I'm calling about your son, Daniel." My heart stopped. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my child. "Is he hurt?" "No, ma'am. He's here in our psychiatric emergency department. He asked me to call you." I sat down on the nearest bench, my paintbrush forgotten in my hand. "What happened?" "He came in this morning saying he was having thoughts of self-harm. During his evaluation, he's been talking extensively about regret over his relationship with his mother. He seems very distressed about a legal situation that happened earlier this year. Daniel was having a mental health crisis, and apparently, I was still his emergency contact, despite everything that had happened. Dr. Kim, I need to be honest with you. Daniel and I have had a very difficult relationship. He tried to have me declared incompetent so he could control my finances. I have a court order restricting his contact with me." "I see." He mentioned that there had been legal proceedings. "Mrs. Hale, I'm not asking you to reconcile with your son or to put yourself in a vulnerable position, but he specifically asked if you would be willing to speak with him, and sometimes family contact can be an important part of crisis intervention." I looked around the peaceful garden, at the flowers I'd been painting, at the life I'd built for myself after escaping Daniel's manipulation. Did I owe him anything after what he'd put me through? "Dr. Kim, if I come to the hospital, will there be staff present during any conversation?" "Absolutely. And you can leave at any time if you feel uncomfortable. I'll be there in an hour." The drive to Ochu gave me time to think about what I wanted to say to my son. I wasn't going to reconcile with him, the trust was too broken for that. But I also wasn't going to let him hurt himself over mistakes that couldn't be undone. Daniel looked terrible. He'd lost weight, his hair was unkempt, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't been sleeping. When I entered the consultation room with Dr. Kim, he started crying immediately. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I know what we did was wrong. I know I hurt you." I sat down across from him, careful to maintain physical and emotional distance. "Daniel, I'm here because you asked for me and because I don't want you to hurt yourself. But I need you to understand that this doesn't change what happened between us. I know. I needed to tell you that I know what we did was awful. Aurora and I, we got so focused on money and what we thought we deserved that we forgot you were a person." Dr. Kim was taking notes, letting us talk but remaining present as a professional buffer. "What happened to Aurora?" I asked. "She left. After the court hearing, she said I was a loser who couldn't even steal money from his own mother properly. She moved back to Phoenix. I felt no satisfaction in Aurora's abandonment of Daniel. She'd used him as much as they'd both used me. Daniel, I want you to get help. Real help from professionals who can teach you healthy ways to handle money and relationships. But I can't be part of your recovery process." "I understand. Mom, I just want you to know that I remember who you used to be to me. Before all this, you were the best mother anyone could ask for, and I threw that away for money." It was the most honest thing Daniel had said to me in years. "I remember who you used to be too," I told him. "And that's the person I hope you can become again, for your own sake." I stayed for an hour, talking with Daniel and Dr. Kim about resources for financial counseling and addiction treatment. Because that's what this had been, an addiction to easy money that had destroyed his judgment and his relationships. When I left the hospital, I felt sad but not guilty. I'd done what I could without compromising my own safety and well-being. Daniel would have to save himself, just like I'd had to save myself. Some lessons could only be learned the hard way. 1 year after the court hearing, I received an invitation that surprised me more than anything that had happened in this entire ordeal. It came from the Washington County Bar Association, asking me to speak at their annual conference on elder law about financial exploitation and family dynamics. "Mrs. Hale, your case has become a teaching example in law schools across the Pacific Northwest," the program coordinator explained over the phone. "Your systematic documentation and successful self-advocacy demonstrate how seniors can protect themselves when family members become predatory." I'd never thought of myself as someone who would speak publicly about personal matters, but the idea of helping other people recognize and resist financial abuse appealed to me. The conference was held at a hotel in downtown Portland, in a ballroom filled with attorneys, social workers, and elder care advocates. I wore my navy blue suit again. It had become my armor for important battles. Financial exploitation by family members is one of the most underreported crimes in America. I began, looking out at an audience of people whose job it was to protect vulnerable adults. It's underreported because victims feel ashamed, because they love their abusers, and because the system often fails to take their concerns seriously. I told my story chronologically, from the surprise wedding announcement through the conservatorship hearing, emphasizing the importance of documentation and professional support. The key insight I want to share is this: competent adults have the right to set financial boundaries, even with family members, even when those family members claim they're trying to help. Setting boundaries isn't evidence of cognitive decline, it's evidence of good judgment. During the question period, an attorney asked what had happened to Daniel and Aurora. "My son received mental health treatment and, as far as I know, is working to rebuild his life in a healthier way. My former daughter-in-law moved away and is no longer part of this story. I have no contact with either of them by choice." Do you ever regret pursuing the legal case instead of trying to work things out within the family? It was a question I'd asked myself many times. There was no family to work with, I said. There were people who shared my DNA and expected access to my bank account, but that's not the same thing as family. Real family doesn't try to steal your independence. After my presentation, several attorneys approached me with their own stories of elder abuse cases, and I realized how common my experience was. Adult children who felt entitled to their parents' resources, grandchildren who manipulated elderly relatives, spouses who financially controlled their partners. The saddest part, one elder law attorney told me, is that most victims never fight back. They just accept the abuse because they think that's what love requires. I'd almost been one of those victims. If I hadn't gotten angry enough to document everything, if I hadn't been lucky enough to have neighbors and professionals who supported me, if I hadn't had the financial resources to hire good legal representation, Daniel and Aurora might have succeeded in their plan. That evening, I sat in my apartment, looking at thank you letters from people who'd heard my speech. One was from a 78-year-old woman whose daughter had been forging checks from her account. Another was from a grandfather whose son had taken out credit cards in his name. "Your story gave me the courage to call the police," one letter read. "I finally understand that protecting myself isn't betraying my family." I'd found an unexpected purpose in my retirement years, helping other people recognize that they deserved to be treated with respect, even by family members who were supposed to love them. My phone rang. It was Linda, calling for our weekly check-in. "How did the speech go?" "Better than I expected. I think I might have a second career as a public speaker." "Maggie, I'm proud of you. Not just for fighting back, but for turning your experience into something that helps other people." After we hung up, I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the mountains in the distance. The view was different from my old house, but it was mine. The apartment was smaller than where I'd lived for 30 years, but it was peaceful. My life was quieter than it used to be, but it was authentic. I'd learned that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. I'd learned that setting boundaries wasn't selfish. I'd learned that real relationships were based on mutual respect, not financial obligation. Most importantly, I'd learned that it was never too late to save yourself, even when the people you needed saving from were the people you'd spent your life loving. I opened my laptop and began typing. If my story could help one more person recognize financial abuse and fight back, then everything I'd been through would have been worth it. Some wounds left scars that became sources of strength. 2 years after winning my independence, I woke up in my apartment on a crisp October morning and realized I felt genuinely content for the first time since Tom died. The sun was streaming through my bedroom windows, highlighting the watercolor painting of Mount Hood I'd completed last month and hung where I could see it first thing each morning. My daily routine had become a source of joy, rather than a series of obligations. Coffee and toast while reading the newspaper on my tablet. Water aerobics at the YMCA 3 mornings a week. Volunteer work at the hospital's information desk on Fridays. Watercolor classes on Tuesdays. Book club twice a month. But the most meaningful change was how I spent my money. Instead of constantly worrying about the next financial emergency Daniel and Aurora would manufacture, I could plan for things I actually wanted to do. I'd taken that Alaska cruise Linda and I had talked about for years, and it was everything Tom and I had dreamed it would be. 7 days of spectacular scenery, interesting people, and no one asking me for rent money. I'd also established a small scholarship fund at the community college for single mothers, studying nursing in memory of my own struggle to balance work and parenting when Daniel was young. The first recipient was a 24-year-old woman named Sarah, who reminded me of myself at that age, determined, overwhelmed, and trying to build a better future for her family. "Mrs. Hale," Sarah had said at the scholarship presentation, "you don't know what this means to me. I can finish school now without worrying about how to pay for childcare." That was what money was supposed to do: solve real problems and create opportunities for people who would use them wisely. My apartment had become a refuge filled with books, art supplies, and most importantly, peace. I'd decorated it with furniture I actually liked, instead of pieces chosen because they were practical or because someone else needed them. My refrigerator held photos of my watercolor group, my book club friends, and the scholarship recipients I'd helped support. No VIPs-only magnets. Just reminders of relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The phone rang, interrupting my morning routine. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Mrs. Hale? This is Jennifer Martinez from the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. We're calling about a case involving Daniel Hale and Aurora Voss." My stomach dropped. Even after 2 years, hearing their names together could still trigger anxiety. "What kind of case?" "They've been arrested for elder financial abuse involving a 72-year-old man in Southeast Portland. The pattern of behavior is very similar to what you documented in your conservatorship case. The prosecutor would like to speak with you about testifying regarding their previous conduct." I closed my eyes, thinking about another elderly person who'd been targeted the way I had been. Another family destroyed by greed disguised as concern. "Mrs. Martinez, I'll testify." That man deserves the same protection I was lucky enough to receive. 2 weeks later, I sat in another courthouse, this time as a witness rather than a defendant. The case was heartbreaking. Harold Chen, a retired postal worker whose nephew and the nephew's girlfriend had systematically drained his savings using the same tactics Daniel and Aurora had tried on me. But Harold didn't have the resources or support system I'd had. By the time someone reported the abuse, they'd taken nearly $40,000 and left him unable to afford his medication or heating bills. Mrs. Hale, the prosecutor asked during my testimony, based on your experience with the defendants, what would you say their primary motivation was? Money, I answered without hesitation. They saw elderly people as resources to be exploited, rather than human beings deserving of respect. The defense attorney tried to suggest that Daniel and Aurora's actions toward me had been motivated by genuine concern, rather than greed. But my documentation told a different story. The financial timeline, the pattern of contact only when money was needed, the escalating harassment, when I set boundaries, it all painted a clear picture of calculated exploitation. Daniel looked different than he had in the hospital 2 years ago. He'd gained back the weight he'd lost, but there was a hardness in his expression that hadn't been there before. He didn't look at me during my testimony, but Aurora stared with the same hostility I remembered from our conservatorship hearing. They were convicted on multiple counts of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Daniel received 18 months in prison and 5 years probation. Aurora got 15 months and was ordered to make full restitution to Harold Chen. After the sentencing, Harold's daughter approached me in the courthouse hallway. Mrs. Hale, thank you for testifying. My father was so ashamed about what happened that he almost didn't report it. Your story helped him understand that he wasn't stupid or weak, he was a victim of criminals. Driving home from the courthouse, I thought about the strange journey my life had taken. 5 years ago, I'd been a lonely widow desperately trying to maintain connection with my only child by enabling his financial irresponsibility. Now I was a confident woman, helping other seniors protect themselves from the kind of abuse I'd escaped. That evening, I called Gus to tell him about the trial. Justice served, he said in his typical understated way. How's Harold Chen doing? Better, according to his daughter. The restitution order means he'll get his money back eventually, and he's connected with senior services for ongoing support. And Daniel? I was quiet for a moment. Despite everything, Daniel was still my son, and part of me would always love the little boy he'd once been. I hope prison gives him time to think about who he wants to be when he gets out. Some people can change, Maggie. Some can't. But that's his choice to make, not your responsibility to manage. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony, looking at the mountains in the distance, thinking about choices and consequences, and the difference between helping people and enabling them. Tomorrow, I'd go back to my volunteer work at the hospital. Tomorrow, I'd paint another watercolor. Tomorrow, I'd spend time with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Tomorrow, I'd continue living the life I'd fought so hard to protect. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came an unexpected sense of renewal that went deeper than just changing seasons. I sat in the Portland Botanical Garden on a warm April morning, my easel positioned to catch the morning light on a bed of purple irises that reminded me of the flowers Tom used to plant in our backyard. My watercolor technique had improved dramatically over the past 3 years. What had started as tentative dabbing with brushes had evolved into confident strokes that captured not just the shape of flowers, but somehow their essence, their quiet dignity in the face of changing seasons. Those are beautiful, Maggie. The voice belonged to Carol, a woman about my age who joined the painting group 6 months ago after her husband passed away. Like me, she was learning to fill the empty spaces in her life with activities that brought joy instead of obligation. Thank you. I never imagined I'd find painting so therapeutic. It's not just the painting, Carol observed, settling her own easel nearby. It's having time that belongs to you, without anyone else's crisis taking priority. She was right, of course. The greatest gift of my new life wasn't financial security or legal protection. It was time that belonged entirely to me. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda. How's my favorite artist today? I sent back a photo of the irises I was painting, along with the view of Mount Hood in the distance. Linda had visited twice since I'd moved to the apartment, and each time she'd commented on how different I seemed. You're yourself again. she'd said during her last visit. The person you were before you started trying to save everyone else. I'd thought about that comment a lot over the past few months. Had I really lost myself so completely in the role of financial rescuer that I'd forgotten who I was without that identity? Looking back, I could see how it had happened gradually. After Tom died, I'd been desperate to feel needed, to have a purpose that made the loneliness bearable. When Daniel and Aurora started having emergencies, helping them had filled that void. It made me feel like a good mother, a useful person, someone who mattered. But somewhere along the way, being needed had become being used, and being used had become being abused. Mrs. Hale? A young woman approached my easel, probably in her 30s, with a toddler in a stroller. I'm sorry to bother you, but are you the Mrs. Hale who speaks at the elder law conferences? I set down my paintbrush and turned to face her. I am. My grandmother attended one of your presentations last year. She said you helped her understand that she didn't have to keep giving money to relatives who never paid her back. The young woman paused, looking emotional. She finally set boundaries with my uncle, and it saved her retirement. Conversations like this happened more often than I'd expected. My story had apparently resonated with many people who'd found themselves in similar situations, trapped between love and exploitation. I'm glad she found the strength to protect herself. She said something you told her that really stuck. Real love doesn't come with a price tag. That changed how she looked at her relationships. After the young woman left, I returned to my painting, thinking about love and price tags, and the difference between supporting people and enabling them. The irises in front of me were thriving because they'd been planted in good soil and given appropriate care, not too much water, not too little, just what they needed to grow strong. Maybe that was the lesson I'd learned too late to apply to Daniel, but could share with others. Healthy relationships required boundaries, just like healthy gardens required pruning. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Patricia Kim from OHSU. Mrs. Hale, I wanted to give you an update on Daniel. He asked me to call you. My heart rate picked up slightly, but not with the panic these calls used to trigger. I'd learned to care about Daniel's well-being without taking responsibility for it. How is he? He's being released next month and has been accepted into a transitional housing program that includes financial counseling and job placement assistance. He wanted you to know that he's committed to rebuilding his life in a healthier way. I'm glad to hear that. He also wanted me to tell you that he doesn't expect any contact from you, and he won't attempt to contact you. He understands that trust, once broken the way he broke it, may never be repairable. It was the most mature message I'd received from Daniel in years. Dr. Kim, I hope he succeeds in building a better life. But you're right, the trust is too damaged for a relationship. He understands. He said to tell you that he's grateful you fought for yourself, because it forced him to face the reality of what he'd become. After hanging up, I sat quietly with my painting, processing the complex emotions that came with news about Daniel. Relief that he was getting help, sadness that we'd never have a normal mother-son relationship, and finally, peace with the knowledge that I'd done everything I could do. The irises in front of me were beginning to fade as the morning warmed into afternoon, but they were still beautiful in their impermanence. Like most things in life, they were meant to be appreciated in the present moment, rather than preserved indefinitely. I added a few final touches to my painting, capturing the play of light and shadow that made the flowers seem alive on the paper. This would be one of my better pieces. I thought not, because the technique was perfect, but because it reflected genuine contentment. Packing up my supplies, I looked around the botanical garden. One more time, at the carefully tended beds and peaceful pathways that had become one of my favorite places in the world. This garden thrived because it was protected from weeds and pests, because someone cared enough to maintain healthy boundaries. Just like my life, the drive home took me through neighborhoods where I'd lived different chapters of my story, past the house where Tom and I had raised Daniel, past the credit union where Sarah still worked and always asked about my painting, past the courthouse where I'd won the fight for my independence. All of it felt like ancient history now, important for the lessons it had taught, but no longer relevant to who I was becoming. My apartment building came into view, and I smiled at the sight of Gus's truck in the visitor parking area. He'd probably stopped by to check on my new neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who was recovering from hip surgery. That was Gus, quietly helpful, without expecting anything in return, the kind of person who made communities stronger. How's the artist today? He asked as I walked past with my easel and painting supplies. Happy, I said, and meant it completely. Good painting day? The best. That evening, I hung my new iris painting next to the others in my living room gallery, a collection of watercolors that documented 3 years of rediscovering who I was when I wasn't busy saving other people from themselves. The painting looked perfect in the warm light from my reading lamp, next to the photos of my scholarship recipients and the thank you letters from people who'd found strength in my story. This was my VIP list now. People who'd earned their place through respect and genuine connection. People who saw me as a complete person rather than a solution to their problems. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite chair with a mystery novel I'd been saving for a quiet evening. Outside my window, the mountains were painted with the soft colors of sunset, and somewhere in the building, I could hear the gentle sounds of other people living their own independent, dignified lives. For the first time since Tom died, I felt truly at home in my own skin. From now on, my VIP list would be built on respect, and I would never again apologize for demanding the love I deserved. That's all for today's story. If you enjoyed it, please hit subscribe and like, and share in the comments where you're listening from. I truly appreciate your support. On the screen, you'll see 2 more stories I recommend. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next story.